In 1877, Colorado, the hardest man in Rimrock hadn't smiled in 5 years, not since grief carved him hollow. Colt Draven pushed away every kind word, every warm glance, every woman who dared to try. Then one dusty afternoon, a stranger's laugh stopped him cold. Green eyes met his, an unguarded smile reached toward the darkness inside him, and for the first time since he'd buried his heart, something cracked. This is the story of the cowboy who refused to feel until she made him remember what it meant to be alive. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The summer sun beat down on Rimrock, Colorado, with the kind of relentless heat that made men question their choices and horses hang their heads low at the hitching posts. Main Street stretched out in a ribbon of packed dirt and wooden boardwalks lined with the usual frontier establishments. Murphy's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Widow Henshaw's boarding house, and the freshly painted sign for the Western Union Telegraph Office. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets lasted about as long as fresh snow in July, and where a man's reputation was built on handshakes, hard work, and how he treated his word. And in Rimrock, everyone knew Colt Draven. They knew he ran the largest cattle operation within 50 miles. They knew his ranch hands were loyal as bloodhounds and feared him almost as much as they respected him. They knew he paid fair wages, kept his debts cleared, and hadn't missed a single payment at the bank since he'd started his spread 8 years ago. But more than anything else, they knew that Colt Draven was a man who had forgotten how to smile. It had been 5 years, 5 long grinding years, since the fever swept through Rimrock, like a biblical plague taking the young and the weak without mercy. The fever had stolen Colt's wife Sarah, a gentle soul with honey-colored hair who sang while she worked in their garden. It had taken their baby boy Thomas, who'd been barely 14 months old, just learning to walk with those uncertain wobbling steps that had made Colt's heart swell with a pride he'd never known before. 3 weeks. That's all it took for the fever to rip his entire world apart. Sarah went first, her body burning up despite every cold compress, every desperate prayer, every plea Colt had whispered into the darkness. Little Thomas followed 2 days later, crying for his mama in a voice that grew weaker and weaker until it finally went silent. Colt had buried them on a hill overlooking his ranch under a cottonwood tree where Sarah used to sit with the baby and watch the sunset. He'd carved their markers himself, his hands shaking so badly he'd had to stop 3 times to keep from breaking down completely. And when he'd patted down the last shovelful of earth, something inside him had died too. The man who walked back down that hill was a ghost wearing Colt Draven's face, in the 5 years since he'd spoken only when necessary. His voice had become a rare commodity, and Rimrock doled out in short, clipped sentences that carried no warmth, no humor, no trace of the man he'd once been. He worked from sunup to sundown, driving himself and his men with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He attended church on Sundays, out of respect for Sarah's memory, but sat in the back pew, leaving before anyone could approach him with their well-meaning condolences. The women of Rimrock had tried bless their hearts. They'd brought casseroles and pies. They'd offered sympathetic smiles and gentle touches on his arm. The younger ones, and some not so young, had set their caps for him with varying degrees of subtlety. After all, Colt Draven was still a fine figure of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He owned land, had money in the bank, and despite his grim demeanor, he was known to be honest and fair. But Colt Draven refused them all. Not with cruelty, he wasn't a cruel man, but with a wall of indifference that was somehow worse than outright rejection. He looked through them as if they were made of glass. He accepted their offerings with a curt nod and returned the dishes cleaned without comment. When the boldest of the town's eligible women tried to engage him in conversation, he responded with monosyllables until they gave up and drifted away wounded and bewildered. That man's heart is locked up tighter than the bank vault, Mrs. Henderson told anyone who would listen. She ran the boarding house and considered herself an expert on matters of the heart. And I don't think there's a key in this territory that could open it. Most folks had given up trying. Colt Draven had become a fixture in Rimrock, reliable, respectable, and utterly unreachable. On this particular afternoon in late August, Colt was riding into town for supplies. His foreman, Jake Morrison, had offered to make the trip, but Colt preferred to handle certain business himself. It gave him something to do, somewhere to go that wasn't his empty house, with its silent rooms and memories that clung to the walls like cobwebs. He tied his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named General, outside Murphy's General Store and stepped onto the boardwalk. The store was dim and cool after the bright heat of the street, smelling of coffee leather and the lavender soap Mrs. Murphy made herself. "Afternoon, Mr. Draven," Tom Murphy called out from behind the counter. He was a portly man with thinning hair and a perpetually cheerful disposition that even 5 years of Colt's silence hadn't dimmed. "Got those fence staples you ordered, and the missus just baked some molasses cookies if you'd like." "Just the staples," Colt said, his voice flat. "And coffee, 2 pounds." "Right you are." Tom's smile faltered only slightly. He'd learned long ago not to take Colt's curtness personally. "Heard your boys brought in a good calf crop this spring. That's fine news." Colt nodded, once his gaze already moving toward the shelves, calculating what else he might need. While Tom gathered his order, Colt found himself near the front window looking out at the street, and that's when he heard it. A laugh. Not just any laugh, not the tittering of the church ladies or the practiced giggles of the saloon girls. This was different. This was genuine, unguarded musical. It rang out like a bell in the afternoon heat, cutting through the usual sounds of the street, the creak of wagon wheels, the stamp of horses, the low murmur of men conducting business. Colt's head turned before he could stop himself. Across the street in front of the stagecoach station, a young woman stood beside a pile of luggage. She wore a traveling suit of deep blue that had probably been fashionable back east, but was already gathering dust from the journey. Her hat had come slightly askew, revealing hair the color of autumn chestnuts pinned up in a style too elaborate for frontier life. She was listening to something Horace Winters, the station manager, was telling her, and as Colt watched, she threw her head back and laughed again. The sound hit him like a punch to the gut. She turned as if sensing his stare, and their eyes met across the width of Main Street. Green. Her eyes were green, the color of new leaves in spring, bright and alive in a face that held none of the practiced coquettishness of women trying to attract a man's attention. She simply looked at him, open and curious, and then impossibly she smiled. Not a smirk, not a calculated display. Just a smile, warm and genuine, the kind of smile a person gives to a fellow human being without agenda or artifice. Something inside Colt's chest twisted painfully. He jerked his gaze away as if he'd been staring at the sun too long, his jaw clenching. His hands, hanging at his sides, curled into fists. "Mr. Draven," Tom Murphy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Colt forced himself to turn back to the counter. "I'm fine, just hot." But his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his wallet. Tom, being a tactful man, didn't comment. He wrapped the staples in coffee and brown paper, tied it with string. "That's Miss Fairborn," he offered conversationally. "Came in on today's stage from Denver. She's Millicent Fairborn's niece, all the way from Boston. Come to claim her aunt's property, I hear. You remember Miss Millicent ran the millinery shop until she passed last spring?" Colt remembered. The old woman had made Sarah's wedding bonnet all those years ago, white silk with tiny pearl beads. Sarah had looked like an angel. He grabbed his packages without responding and headed for the door. "Give my regards to Jake," Tom called after him, ever hopeful for normalcy. Colt stepped back out into the heat and made the mistake of glancing across the street once more. The young woman, Miss Fairborn, was directing 2 boys on where to carry her trunks. She moved with easy authority, clearly used to being in charge of her own affairs. As Colt watched, she handed each boy a coin, and their faces lit up. She said something that made them grin, then turned toward the narrow building 3 doors down from the stage station. Her aunt's millinery shop. Colt forced himself to look away and began loading his supplies into his saddlebags, but his hands, which were normally steady as stone, fumbled with the buckles. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice drawled behind him. Colt turned to find Doc Pritchard leaning against the post outside his office next door, a half-smoked cigar in his hand and amusement dancing in his weathered eyes. The doc was in his 60s, had seen just about everything the frontier could throw at a man, and had patched up Colt more than once over the years. "Don't start," Colt said, his voice carrying a warning. "Didn't say a word," Doc replied innocently. Just noticing that you're staring at that young lady like you've never seen a woman before. I'm not staring. Sure you're not. Doc took a puff of his cigar. For what it's worth, she seems like a decent sort. Smart, too. Already been by to introduce herself, asked about her aunt's final days. Handled the news like a grown woman, not a fainting flower. Town could use someone like that. Colt swung up into his saddle, his movements sharp. Town's not lacking for women. Maybe not, but it's been lacking for one that could make you look twice. Doc's eyes were kind beneath his bushy eyebrows. Sarah wouldn't want you living like this, son. You know that. The words hit like a whip, sharp and stinging. Colt's jaw clenched so hard it ached. My life is none of your concern, Doc. Maybe not, but you were a good man once, Colt Draven. Hate to see that man buried on a hill alongside the people he loved. Without another word, Colt wheeled General around and headed out of town at a pace just short of a gallop. He didn't look back. He didn't let himself. But all the way back to the ranch, he heard that laugh in his head, warm and bright and alive. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence in his skull wasn't quite complete. The Draven ranch house sat in a valley between two low ridges sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by the natural geography and a stand of cottonwoods that Sarah had loved. It was a solid structure, 2 stories built from lumber, hauled in from Denver at considerable expense. Colt had designed it himself back when he'd believed in futures and families and the permanence of happiness. Now it was too big for one man, too full of echoes. Jake Morrison was waiting by the corral when Colt rode in. Jake was 10 years older than Colt, grizzled and bow-legged from decades in the saddle, and one of the few men Colt still trusted completely. He'd been with the ranch since the beginning, had helped bury Sarah and little Thomas, and had never once treated Colt with the pitying glances others couldn't seem to help. "Get what you needed?" Jake asked, taking General's reins as Colt dismounted. "Yeah." Jake waited, knowing Colt well enough to sense something was off. "Town busy?" Stagecoach came in. "Ah." Jake began unsaddling the horse with practiced efficiency. "Heard old Millicent Fairborn's niece was due in today. Boston gal, they say. Wonder how long she'll last out here before she runs back east with her tail between her legs." Colt didn't answer. He grabbed his supplies and headed toward the house. "Boss," Jake called after him. Colt stopped but didn't turn around. "We got a problem with one of the fences in the north pasture. Mountain lions been prowling around, knocked down about 20 feet of posts trying to get at the calves. Thought you'd want to know. I'll ride out after supper." "Want company?" "No." Jake nodded, unsurprised. "Suit yourself. I'll have Cookie put aside some grub for you." Inside the house, Colt dropped his supplies on the kitchen table and stood in the silence. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stillness. Sarah's kitchen. Though he tried not to think of it that way anymore. She'd been so proud of the big cast-iron stove, the deep sink with the pump that brought well water right inside. Modern conveniences for a modern life. He should eat something. Cookie, the ranch's cook, always sent him home with enough food for 3 men, worried that Colt wasn't taking care of himself. But Colt wasn't hungry. Instead, he found himself walking through the house like a stranger, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The parlor with furniture Sarah had picked out from a catalog, sitting exactly where she'd placed it 5 years ago. The bedroom upstairs that he still slept in, though he'd stripped it of everything that reminded him of her, the lace curtains, the wedding quilt, the photograph in the silver frame, and the small room next to it. The nursery. Colt hadn't opened that door in 5 years. He stood in front of it now, his hand on the knob, breathing hard like he'd run a mile uphill. Through the wood, he could almost hear Thomas's laugh, that baby giggle that had been the best sound in the world. Could almost smell the talcum powder and milk and that indefinable sweetness that all babies carried. His hand dropped. He couldn't. Not today. Maybe not ever. He went back downstairs, grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace, and headed back out to saddle a fresh horse. Work. That's what he needed. Work and distance, and the clean simplicity of mending what was broken as long as it wasn't himself. 3 days passed before Colt went back to town. He told himself it was necessary. He needed to place an order for more lumber at the mill, had to file some paperwork at the land office, should probably visit the bank. All legitimate business. The fact that he found himself checking his reflection in the mirror before leaving that he'd actually put on a clean shirt had nothing to do with anything. Jake had noticed, of course. "You're awful spruced up for filing paperwork," he'd observed, leaning against the barn door with his arms crossed and a knowing glint in his eye. Man can't take pride in his appearance. Man can. You generally don't. Colt had ignored him and ridden out. The town was busier than usual for midweek. A freight wagon was being unloaded outside Murphy's store, and a group of ranch hands from the Circle K were causing their usual ruckus outside the saloon. Colt tied up in front of the land office and tried to ignore the fact that his eyes kept drifting 3 doors down to the millinery shop. The windows had been cleaned. He could see that even from here. Fresh curtains hung inside simple white cotton that moved slightly in the breeze from the open door, and painted on the glass in neat gold letters, "Fairborn Millinery, Fine Hats and Accessories, Proprietress Miss Lydia Fairborn." Lydia. So that was her name. "Mr. Draven," a cheerful voice interrupted his thoughts. "How wonderful to see you." Colt turned to find Mrs. Henderson bearing down on him, her considerable bosom leading the way like the prow of a ship. She ran the boarding house and was the town's premier source of gossip, delivered with a smile so warm it was almost forgivable. "Ma'am," Colt acknowledged with a curt nod, already planning his escape. But Mrs. Henderson was not easily deterred. "Have you met our new resident yet?" "Miss Fairborn? Such a delightful young woman, and so accomplished. She's been absolutely transforming that old shop. Poor Millicent." God rest her soul, had let things get rather dusty in her final years, but Miss Fairborn has worked miracles. Simply miracles. And her hats. "Oh, Mr. Draven, you should see them. Such artistry." "I'm sure they're fine," Colt said, edging toward the land office door. "You know, she was asking about the local ranches just yesterday. Very interested in the workings of frontier life. I told her you run the finest operation in the county. Perhaps you might stop by and introduce yourself properly. It's only neighborly." The suggestion sent an unexpected bolt of something panic anticipation through Colt's chest. "I'm sure she's busy settling in. Doesn't need interruptions." "Nonsense. She specifically said she hoped to meet more of the local business people. And you are quite prominent, Mr. Draven. It would be rude not to—" "Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," Colt said firmly, and escaped into the land office before she could marshal further arguments. Inside, he spent 20 minutes on paperwork that should have taken 5, his mind wandering despite his best efforts. When he finally emerged back onto the street, Mrs. Henderson had thankfully moved on to torture some other victim with her enthusiastic matchmaking. Colt stood on the boardwalk, the paperwork tucked under his arm, and found himself looking at the millinery shop again. The door was open to catch the breeze. Through it, he could see movement, a flash of blue fabric the same color as the traveling suit she'd worn 3 days ago. His feet began moving before his brain gave permission. He crossed the street, dodging a wagon and ignoring the curious looks from a couple of men sitting outside the hardware store. The millinery shop was small, wedged between a dressmaker and a vacant storefront. As he approached, he could hear humming a melody he didn't recognize but found oddly pleasant. Colt stopped in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "What the hell was he doing? I'll be right with you," a voice called from the back of the shop. "Please feel free to look around." The interior was indeed transformed from the dusty, cluttered space he vaguely remembered from years past. The walls had been painted a soft cream color, and shelves lined them, displaying an array of hats in various styles and states of completion. A large work table dominated the center of the room, covered with ribbons, feathers, and other mysterious feminine accoutrements. Everything was neat, organized, surprisingly professional. And then she emerged from the back room carrying a hat box and stopped short when she saw him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Up close, Lydia Fairborn was even more striking than she'd been from across the street. Her face was heart-shaped with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Her green eyes were bright with intelligence and something else, a kind of openness that Colt had forgotten existed in the world. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something about her that made it hard to look away. "Oh," she said, and her face broke into that same genuine smile he'd seen 3 days ago. "Hello, you're Mr. Draven, aren't you?" Colt's throat had gone dry. "Ma'am?" "Mrs. Henderson described you quite thoroughly. I'm Lydia Fairborn." She set down the hat box and extended her hand as if they were equals meeting in a city parlor rather than a frontier millinery shop. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Colt looked at her offered hand for a moment, then took it briefly. Her grip was firm, her palm soft but not delicate. She didn't hold on too long or try any of the flirtatious touches some women employed. Just a straightforward handshake, and then she released him. "I hope you'll forgive the mess," Lydia continued, gesturing around the shop. "I'm still getting organized. Aunt Millicent kept excellent records, but her filing system was creative." "Looks fine," Colt managed. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Lydia's smile didn't waver. "Can I help you with something? I don't imagine you came in for a hat, but I do also carry handkerchiefs, gloves, and a few other accessories, and I'm happy to take special orders if—" "No, I don't need anything." The words came out too abrupt, almost rude. Lydia's smile faltered slightly, and Colt felt a twist of something that might have been regret. "I see," she said, her voice still pleasant but more cautious. "Well, thank you for stopping by anyway." It was a dismissal politely delivered. Colt should have taken it, should have turned around and walked out, and never thought about Lydia Fairborn again. Instead, he heard himself say, "Your aunt made my wife's wedding bonnet, years ago." Lydia's expression shifted surprise and something softer moving across her face. "Did she? I didn't know. Aunt Millicent and we weren't as close as we should have been. I'm afraid I was too busy with my own life back east to visit as often as I might have." There was genuine regret in her voice, and Colt found himself responding to it despite his intentions. She was a good woman, fair in her dealings. "That's kind of you to say." Lydia hesitated, then asked gently, "Your wife, is she—" "Dead. 5 years now." He said it bluntly, the way he always did, using the stark word like a shield. Most people flinched from it, stammered condolences, couldn't get away fast enough. But Lydia Fairborn simply nodded her green eyes, holding his with a steadiness that was somehow more comforting than any practiced sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "That must have been very difficult." And because she didn't elaborate, didn't pry, didn't offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds or God's mysterious ways, Colt felt something in his chest loosen slightly. "It was a long time ago," he said, which wasn't quite a lie, but wasn't quite the truth either. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule," Lydia replied. "At least that's what I learned when my father passed 3 years ago. People kept telling me I should be over it by such and such a time, as if sorrow operates on a timetable. But it doesn't work that way, does it?" Colt stared at her. In 5 years, no one had said anything that came close to understanding what he felt. Everyone had expected him to mourn for an appropriate period, and then move on, return to normal, be the man he'd been before. They didn't understand that the man he'd been before had died on that hill along with Sarah and Thomas. But this woman, this stranger from Boston, who'd been in town less than a week, somehow understood. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." Lydia smiled again, and this time it held a shade of shared sorrow that made it somehow more genuine. "Well, Mr. Draven, you're welcome in my shop anytime, whether you need a hat or not. Sometimes it's nice to have a place to escape to for a few moments." It was an offer made without expectation, and that made it almost impossible to refuse. Colt nodded once, turned to leave, and made it all the way to the door before stopping. "The bonnet," he said without turning around. "My wife's bonnet. It had pearl beads, small ones all around the brim." "That sounds lovely," Lydia said softly behind him. It was. And then Colt Draven walked out into the sunlight, his heart beating harder than it had in 5 years, and had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The walk back to where General was tied felt longer than it should have. Colt's boots struck the boardwalk with a hollow sound that seemed too loud in his own ears, and he was acutely aware that half the town had probably noticed him emerging from the millinery shop. By nightfall, the gossips would have him fitted for a wedding suit. The thought should have irritated him. Instead, he felt oddly numb, as if some protective layer he'd worn for 5 years had been scraped away, leaving raw nerves exposed to the air. Jake was going to have a field day with this. Sure enough, when Colt rode back into the ranch that evening, his foreman took one look at his face and grinned like a cat with cream. "So, how was town?" "Fine. Get your paperwork filed." Yes. Visit the bank. No. Huh. Jake leaned against the fence rail, his arms crossed clearly, enjoying himself. Funny thing, I ran into Pete Carson about an hour ago. He said he saw you coming out of the millinery shop. Said you were in there a good 10 minutes. Colt dismounted and began unsaddling General with more force than necessary. Pete Carson needs to mind his own business. Pete Carson is the nosiest man in 3 counties. You know that. Jake's grin widened. So, what'd you buy new hat fancy handkerchief? I didn't buy anything. Just went in to look at the pretty ribbons then. Colt shot him a look that would have silenced most men. Jake, who'd known him too long to be intimidated, just laughed. Boss, I haven't seen you this riled up in years. It's almost nice to know you still got blood in your veins instead of ice water. Leave it alone, Jake. Can't do that. You know why. Jake's voice lost some of its teasing edge. Because for 5 years I've watched you turn into a ghost, working yourself half to death, pushing everyone away, living in that big empty house like you're waiting to die. And now for the first time since Sarah passed, I see something in your eyes that ain't just hollow grief. So no boss. I ain't gonna leave it alone. Colt's hand stilled on the saddle. He stood there, his back to Jake, wrestling with words that didn't want to come. Finally, he said, she asked about Sarah. And she didn't treat it like a disease. Didn't get that look people get like they're afraid grief might be catching. Colt turned around, meeting Jake's eyes. She lost her father 3 years back. She understands. Jake nodded slowly. That's good, boss. That's real good. It doesn't mean anything. Didn't say it did. But it don't mean nothing either. Jake pushed off from the fence. Come on, Cookie's got stew on, and if we don't get in there soon, the boys will eat it all. They walked toward the bunkhouse together, and for the first time in longer than Colt could remember, the silence between them felt comfortable instead of suffocating. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange blur. Colt threw himself into work with his usual intensity, mending fences, moving cattle, checking water sources, dealing with 1,000 small crises that running a ranch entailed. But beneath the familiar rhythms of frontier life, something had shifted. He found himself noticing things he'd stopped seeing years ago. The way morning light painted the hills gold, the sound of Jake's laughter drifting from the bunkhouse, the taste of Cookie's coffee strong and bitter, and somehow exactly right. And he found himself thinking about Lydia Fairborn at the oddest moments. The town, meanwhile, was abuzz with news of her. Every time Colt went in for supplies, which seemed to be happening more frequently than strictly necessary, he heard fresh reports. Mrs. Henderson was more than happy to provide updates whether he asked for them or not. She's quite the businesswoman. Mrs. Henderson informed him one afternoon, cornering him outside the post office. Already took orders for 6 custom hats. 6. In less than 2 weeks. And such modern designs. She showed me sketches from fashion magazines back east. Very sophisticated. From Tom Murphy at the general store. Smart as a whip, that Miss Fairborn. Negotiated credit terms with me that would make a railroad lawyer proud. Fair, though. Always fair. From Doc Pritchard. She came by to ask about medical supplies. Wants to keep a proper first aid kit in her shop. Said back in Boston she volunteered at a charity hospital. Not many women out here would think of that. Even Reverend Matthews had opinions. Attended her first Sunday service this week. Lovely voice. Alto. Asked intelligent questions about my sermon afterward. The congregation is quite taken with her. Colt absorbed all this information in silence, filing it away like a miser hoarding coins. He told himself he was just being neighborly, keeping informed about new residents. He told himself it didn't matter that Lydia Fairborn was apparently everything a frontier town could want. Smart, capable, kind, and independent. He told himself a lot of things that weren't quite true. It was Jake who finally called him on it. They were riding the North Range checking for breaks in the fence line when his foreman said casually, "You planning on actually talking to her again, or just going to keep collecting gossip like an old spinster?" Colt's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't. That's why you found reasons to go into town 4 times in 2 weeks when you used to go once a month." Jake spat a stream of tobacco juice and gave Colt a sideways look. "And that's why you get this look on your face every time someone mentions her name. Like you're trying real hard not to care, which means you care more than you want to admit. You're seeing things that aren't there. Am I Then why ain't you looked me in the eye once during this conversation? Colt reined in his horse and turned to face Jake squarely. Fine. You want the truth? I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Every time I think about her, I feel guilty, like I'm betraying Sarah's memory. But every time I try to stop thinking about her, I feel guilty about that too, like I'm supposed to be dead inside forever because Sarah died. So, no, Jake. I don't have a plan. I don't know what to do, and I'd appreciate it if you'd just let me figure it out without commentary. Jake studied him for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he said quietly, Sarah was good people. Best thing that ever happened to you, bar none. But boss, she wouldn't want you living like a corpse for the rest of your days. That girl loved you. She'd want you to be happy. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. Because I knew her too, remember? And I remember how she used to worry about you working too hard, not taking time for yourself. Jake, she'd say to me, make sure Colt eats a proper meal now and then. Make sure he sleeps. She cared about your happiness more than just about anything. Jake's voice gentled. That don't change just because she's gone. Colt felt his throat tighten. He looked away out over the rolling prairie and blinked hard against the burning in his eyes. I miss her, Jake. Every damn day. I know you do, and you always will, but missing someone and refusing to live are two different things. Jake gathered his reins. Come on, that fence won't mend itself. They rode on in silence, but something in Colt's chest had loosened just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. 3 days later, the storm rolled in. Colt was in town on legitimate business this time, meeting with the banker about a loan to expand his herd when the sky began to darken. By the time he stepped out of the bank, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and the promise of a serious blow. Better get home quick, Mr. Draven, the bank clerk called from the doorway. This one looks like it'll be a gully washer. Colt nodded and headed for where General was tied. But before he could mount up, the first drops began to fall fat and cold and coming fast. Within seconds, it was a downpour, the kind of sudden storm that turned streets to rivers and made visibility drop to almost nothing. Colt stood there, rain streaming off his hat brim, trying to decide whether to ride out in this mess or wait it out. The nearest shelter that wasn't the saloon was Mr. Draven. A voice cut through the drumming rain. Mr. Draven, come inside before you drown. He turned to see Lydia Fairborn standing in the doorway of her shop, one hand holding the door open against the wind, the other beckoning urgently. Her face was lit by the warm glow of lamplight from inside, and rain was already soaking the threshold where she stood. Colt hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. He secured General under the nearest awning. The horse would be fine for a while and splashed across the street to the millinery shop. Lydia pulled him inside and shut the door firmly against the storm. Goodness, she said, slightly breathless. That came on fast, didn't it? Colt stood just inside the door, dripping onto her clean floor, suddenly aware that he was tracking mud and water everywhere. I'm making a mess. Floors can be cleaned. Pneumonia is harder to cure. Lydia was already moving deeper into the shop. Come away from the door. I'll get some towels. She disappeared into the back room, leaving Colt standing awkwardly in the main shop. It looked different from his last visit. More hats on display, a new arrangement of ribbons hanging from a clever pegboard system, a comfortable-looking chair near the window that hadn't been there before. The whole place had an air of settled purpose, as if Lydia Fairborn had taken root in Rimrock and had no intention of leaving. She returned with an armful of towels, not fancy ones, but practical cotton that had clearly been designated for general use. Here, get out of that coat before you catch your death. Colt shrugged out of his duster, which was soaked through, and accepted the towel. As he dried his face and hair, he watched Lydia spread another towel on the floor to catch the water still dripping from his clothes. I have a small stove in the back room, she said, straightening. I was just making tea. Would you like some? It'll help warm you up. The offer was casual matter-of-fact, with none of the fluttering nervousness some women might have displayed at finding themselves alone with a man. Colt found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to accept. Good. Lydia smiled and gestured toward the chair by the window. Sit. I'll be right back. She vanished into the back room again, and Colt heard the clink of china, the whistle of a kettle. He moved to the chair she'd indicated and sat feeling oddly like an intruder in this feminine space. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows, and the shop smelled of fabric and lavender, and something he couldn't quite identify, something that might have been hope. Lydia returned carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea, a small pitcher of milk, and a plate of cookies. She set it on the work table and handed him one of the cups. "I'm afraid I don't have sugar. I haven't quite gotten around to fully stocking my personal supplies yet, but the tea is good quality. I brought it from Boston." Colt accepted the cup, warming his hands on the china. "This is fine. Thank you." Lydia settled into the other chair. She pulled over her own cup, cradled in her hands, and looked out at the storm with an expression of contentment. "I love rain," she said. "Back in Boston, I used to sit by my window and watch it fall for hours. There's something peaceful about it, don't you think?" "Never thought much about it," Colt admitted. "Usually just means muddy work and miserable cattle." She laughed, that same genuine laugh he'd heard on her first day in town. "I suppose ranching doesn't leave much room for romantic notions about weather." "Not much, no." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping tea and watching the rain. Then Lydia said, "May I ask you something, Mr. Draven?" Colt tensed slightly. "Depends on the question. How long have you run your ranch?" It was innocuous enough, and Colt felt his shoulders relax. 8 years. Started with a quarter section and 100 head. Built it up from there. "That's impressive. I understand ranching is quite difficult." Lydia set down her cup. "I'll confess I know almost nothing about it. Back east, beef just appeared in the butcher shop. I never thought much about where it came from or how it got there." "Most people don't. But I'd like to learn. Part of living here, I think, is understanding how the community works. What people do, why it matters." She looked at him with those clear green eyes. "Would you mind telling me about it?" "Just the basics. I promise not to take up too much of your time." And so as the storm raged outside, Colt found himself talking about ranching. He started with the simple facts: cattle breeds, grazing patterns, water management. But as Lydia asked intelligent questions and listened with genuine interest, he found himself going deeper. He talked about the challenges of frontier ranching, the balance between ambition and sustainability, the satisfaction of watching something grow from almost nothing into something substantial. He talked about things he hadn't discussed with anyone except Jake in years. "It sounds like you love it," Lydia observed at one point. Colt considered that. "I did. Once. And now—" He was quiet for a moment, looking into his tea as if it might hold answers. "Now it's just what I do, what I'm good at." "That's a shame," Lydia said softly. "Passion makes all the difference between existing and living." The words hit him like a punch. Because she was right. He'd been existing for 5 years, going through motions, fulfilling obligations. But living, actually engaging with life, finding joy or purpose or anything beyond the next task on his endless list. He hadn't done that since Sarah died. "You speak from experience," Colt said, deflecting. Lydia nodded. "I do. After my father passed, I spent months just going through the motions. Getting up, getting dressed, managing his affairs, dealing with all the tedious details that come with death. And then one day I realized I'd forgotten what his laugh sounded like. That terrified me, the idea that I might forget him entirely if I didn't start actually living again." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "So I made myself find something to care about. For me, it was this." She gestured around the shop. "Creating beautiful things, making women feel special, building something of my own." "Is that why you came west to start over?" "Partly, but also because I was suffocating back east. Too many expectations. Too many people telling me what a proper young lady should and shouldn't do. Out here, nobody knows me. Nobody has preconceived notions about who Lydia Fairborn should be. I can decide that for myself." She looked at him thoughtfully. "I imagine you understand that. The freedom of frontier life." "Maybe once," Colt admitted. Before grief took that freedom away," Lydia finished gently. "I understand, but Mr. Draven, here's what I learned. Grief doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a companion. Something you carry with you, but not something that owns you completely." Colt stared at her, his heart hammering. How did she do that? How did she put into words things he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate? You make it sound simple. He said, his voice rough. It's not simple at all. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do. But I think it's worth it. She smiled. And I think your wife would agree. The mention of Sarah should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt like a gift, an acknowledgement that his past mattered, that loving Sarah hadn't been a mistake, even though losing her had nearly destroyed him. She would have liked you, Colt heard himself say. Lydia's smile widened, genuine pleasure lighting her face. That's one of the kindest things anyone's ever said to me. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. The hammering downpour had gentled to a steady patter, and the thunder had moved off toward the mountains. Colt realized with surprise that more than an hour had passed. He'd been so absorbed in conversation and talking to another human being beyond surface pleasantries that he'd lost track of time. I should go, he said, but didn't move. You should, Lydia agreed, but her tone suggested she wasn't in any hurry to see him leave. Colt stood setting his empty cup on the tray. Thank you for the tea, and for... He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate what she'd actually given him. For conversation, Lydia supplied, rising as well. You're welcome. Any time, Mr. Draven. Truly. He nodded and moved toward the door, retrieving his still damp duster. As he put it on, Lydia said, Mr. Draven, I meant what I said before. You're welcome here whether you need a hat or not. Sometimes a person just needs a place to be. Colt looked at her, really looked at her. She stood in the lamplight of her shop, surrounded by ribbons and hats and all the trappings of femininity, but there was nothing fragile about her. She was strong in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the core of who she was. Call me Colt, he said. Her smile could have lit the whole shop. Only if you'll call me Lydia. Lydia, he repeated, and the name felt right in his mouth, natural. Safe ride home, Colt. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and stepped back out into the rain. The ride back to the ranch was wet and uncomfortable, but Colt barely noticed. His mind kept replaying the afternoon Lydia's laugh, her thoughtful questions, the way she'd talked about grief, not as something to overcome, but as something to integrate into life. The way she'd made him feel for the first time in 5 years, like maybe he wasn't broken beyond repair. Jake was waiting when he rode in, and one look at Colt's face had the older man grinning. That good, huh? Shut up, Jake. Can't shut up. This is too entertaining. You got that look about you. What look? The look of a man who's just remembered what it feels like to be alive. Jake clapped him on the shoulder. About damn time, boss. For once, Colt didn't argue. 2 weeks later, Lydia showed up at the ranch. Colt was working with a young horse in the corral, a bay filly with potential but a stubborn streak, when he heard Jake's surprised exclamation from the barn. He turned to see a small buggy coming up the drive, and his heart did something complicated in his chest when he recognized the driver. Lydia handled the reins with competence, bringing the buggy to a neat stop near the house. She was dressed practically a simple brown skirt and white shirtwaist, with a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. But she still looked impossibly out of place against the rough backdrop of the ranch, like a flower growing in the middle of a rock pile. Colt handed the filly's lead rope to one of his hands and walked over, acutely aware that he was dusty and sweaty and probably smelled like horse. Lydia. Colt. She smiled, apparently unbothered by his appearance. I hope I'm not intruding. I probably should have sent word ahead, but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come. Why would I do that? Because you strike me as a man who values his privacy. She climbed down from the buggy with easy grace. But I have a proposition for you, and I thought it was best presented in person. Jake had materialized from the barn, his curiosity barely concealed. Colt shot him a warning look, which his foreman ignored completely. Ma'am, Jake said, touching his hat brim. Welcome to the Draven Ranch. Name's Jake Morrison. I'm the foreman here. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I'm Lydia Fairborn. Oh, I know who you are, ma'am. Whole town's been talking about you. Jake's grin was shameless. In a good way, of course. Lydia laughed. Of course. Small towns are the same everywhere. Everyone knows everyone else's business. And most of them enjoy it, Jake agreed. Can I offer you some coffee? Cookie just made a fresh pot. Before Lydia could answer, Colt said, "We'll take coffee up at the house. Thank you, Jake." It was a dismissal, and Jake knew it. His grin widened, but he nodded amiably. "Sure thing, boss. Miss Fairborn, pleasure meeting you." "Likewise, Mr. Morrison." Colt gestured toward the house, and Lydia fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a moment, and then Lydia said, "He seems nice." "He's a busybody. He cares about you. That's different." Colt couldn't argue with that. He led her up onto the porch and into the house, suddenly seeing it through her eyes. The sparse furniture, the dust on surfaces he never thought to clean, the general air of abandonment that clung to rooms he passed through but didn't really inhabit. "I know it's not much," he started. "It's a beautiful house," Lydia said firmly. "Good bones, solid construction, and look at that view." She moved to the window overlooking the valley. "No wonder you chose this spot." Colt busied himself making coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. "You said you had a proposition." "I do." Lydia turned from the window. "I'm designing a new line of hats, Western styles, adapted for practical use. Not the frilly things women wear back east, but actual functional hats that can stand up to sun and wind and hard work. But I realize I don't actually know much about what that hard work entails. So I was hoping you might let me observe ranch life for a day or two, see how women actually function out here, what they need from their clothing and accessories." She smiled. "I'd pay you for your time, of course, and I promise not to get in the way." Colt poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "You want to follow me around watching me work?" "Essentially, yes, and perhaps talk to any women who work here or visit. I want to understand the reality of frontier life, not the romanticized version." She sipped her coffee, made a face. Cookie brewed it strong enough to strip paint, but didn't complain. "I know it's an unusual request." It was unusual. It was also oddly appealing, the idea of having Lydia around, seeing his world through her eyes. And if he was being honest with himself, he'd been looking for excuses to see her again since that afternoon in her shop. "You don't have to pay me," he said, "but you'll need to come at dawn. We start early." Lydia's face lit up. "Really? You'll let me?" "On one condition." "Name it." "You follow my instructions exactly. Ranch work is dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. I won't have you getting hurt." "I can follow instructions," Lydia promised. "When should I come?" "Day after tomorrow. That'll give you time to get whatever you need, and wear practical clothes, nothing fancy." "I own practical clothes, I'll have you know. I'm not completely helpless." But she was grinning as she said it. "Thank you, Colt. This means a lot to me." They finished their coffee, making small talk. Lydia told him about her latest orders. He told her about the new foals born this spring. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, without the awkward pauses that usually plagued Colt's interactions with people. When Lydia finally said she should head back to town, Colt found himself reluctant to see her go. He walked her back to the buggy and helped her up. "Drive carefully. Road gets rough in spots." "I will. See you day after tomorrow, bright and early." As the buggy rattled back down the drive, Jake appeared at Colt's elbow. "Well, well, well. Don't start." "Wouldn't dream of it, boss. Just gonna observe that you're smiling. That's all. Just observing." Colt touched his face and realized with surprise that Jake was right. He was smiling, and it felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Lydia arrived at the ranch 2 mornings later, just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold. She drove up in her buggy, wearing split riding skirts, sturdy boots, and a practical shirtwaist with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair was braided and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that looked suspiciously like one she'd made herself. Colt, who'd been watching the drive since before sunrise, not that he'd admit it, met her at the corral. "Morning." "Good morning." Lydia's enthusiasm was almost painful at this hour. "What are we doing first?" First you're meeting the horses, then we'll ride out to check the cattle in the south pasture." The day unfolded with a rhythm that Colt had almost forgotten could be pleasant. Lydia proved to be a competent rider, not expert, but confident enough that he didn't have to worry about her falling off. She asked endless questions, taking notes in a small book she produced from her pocket. She met his men with easy friendliness, not flirting, but genuinely interested in their lives and work. She helped Cookie prepare lunch cheerfully, peeling potatoes and stirring pots without complaint. And she never once looked at Colt with pity or calculation or any of the complex emotions other women had tried to project. She just saw him as he was and seemed content with that. "This is harder work than I imagined," she admitted as they rode back toward the ranch house in late afternoon. "I have a whole new respect for frontier women." "Most of them are tough as nails," Colt agreed. "Have to be to survive out here." "Like your wife?" Lydia asked gently. Colt was quiet for a moment, but found the question didn't hurt as much as it might have weeks ago. "Yeah, like Sarah. She could handle anything, cooking for a dozen hands during roundup, tending a garden in soil that barely wanted to grow anything, nursing sick animals through the night. She never complained, not once." "She sounds remarkable." She was. Colt looked over at Lydia. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in looks, Sarah was blonde small, but in the way you approach things. Practical, capable, not afraid of hard work." "That's quite a compliment," Lydia said softly. They rode in companionable silence for a while, and then Lydia said, "Can I tell you something?" "Go ahead." "I wasn't entirely honest about why I came here today. I mean, yes, I do want to design better hats, but mostly—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Mostly I wanted to see you, to spend time with you, and I thought if I gave it a practical purpose, you might be more likely to say yes." Colt's heart did that complicated thing again. "Why?" "Because I enjoy your company. Because when I talk to you, I don't have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who I am. Because—" She laughed a little nervously. "Because you're the first person I've met in a very long time who makes me want to be brave enough to be honest." They'd reached the corral. Colt dismounted and moved to help Lydia down. But instead of just taking her hand, he stood there looking up at her. This woman who'd somehow managed to slip past his defenses without him even noticing. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Both days. And not just for the hat research." Lydia's smile was radiant. "Good. Because I'd like to come back. If you'll have me." "Any time," Colt said, and meant it. Jake, watching from the barn, shook his head in wonder. He'd worked for Colt Draven for 8 years, had seen him through the worst tragedy a man could face, had watched him build walls so high nobody could scale them. And now here was this slight woman from Boston, barely weighing 100 pounds, and those walls were crumbling like they were made of sand. Later that evening, after Lydia had gone back to town and the ranch had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Jake found Colt sitting on the porch, staring out at nothing in particular. "Bossed up," Jake said, settling into the other chair. "I gotta say something, and you're gonna hear me out whether you want to or not." Colt sighed. "Go ahead." "That woman, Miss Fairborn, she's good for you. I ain't seen you this alive since before Sarah passed. You're talking again, smiling. Hell, you laughed today when she said that thing about the rooster. Actual laughing." Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "And here's the thing. She's the first soul you've spoken more than 10 words to in years. The first person who seems to get through all that ice you wrapped yourself in." Colt didn't respond immediately. He sat there wrestling with feelings he'd tried to bury for 5 years. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can do this, Jake. What if I lose her too? What if I let myself care and then you'll hurt," Jake said bluntly. "You'll hurt like hell, same as before. But boss, you're already hurting. You've been hurting for 5 years straight. At least if you let yourself feel something good, you'll have that to balance it out." "It feels like betraying Sarah." "It ain't. Sarah loved you. She'd want you to be happy. And I think hell I know that woman in there today would make you happy if you let her." Colt closed his eyes, feeling the truth of Jake's words settle into his bones. He was tired. So tired of being alone, of carrying grief like a millstone, of going through life like a ghost. And Lydia made him want to try, made him want to be the man he'd been before tragedy had hollowed him out. "It scares me," he admitted quietly, "how much I already care about her." Jake nodded. "That's how you know it's real, boss. That's how you know it matters." They sat in silence for a while, and then Colt said, "She's coming back tomorrow to finish her research." "Yeah," Jake's grin was audible in his voice. "That's good. That's real good." And as Colt sat there in the darkness, watching stars appear one by one over his ranch, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Lydia did come back the next day, and the day after that. And before Colt quite understood how it had happened, her visits to the ranch had become a regular occurrence, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. She always had a reason: more research for her hat designs, questions about ranch life, or bringing fresh bread from the bakery to share with the men. But both of them knew the reasons were just excuses, ways to spend time together without having to acknowledge what was really happening between them. The ranch hands noticed, of course. They'd have to be blind not to. But to Colt's surprise, none of them teased him the way Jake did. Instead, they treated Lydia with a kind of gentle respect that told him his men understood what she meant, not just to him, but to all of them. She'd brought something back to the Draven Ranch that had been missing for 5 years' warmth. Cookie was particularly taken with her. The grizzled old cook, who usually growled at anyone who invaded his kitchen, welcomed Lydia like a long-lost daughter. She'd sit at his work table, peeling vegetables or kneading dough, while he told stories of his days as a trail cook, and Cookie would actually smile in expression most of the hands had thought his face was no longer capable of forming. "That woman's good medicine," Cookie told Colt one evening. "Got a healing way about her, the kind that don't make a fuss, just makes things better by being there." Colt couldn't argue with that assessment. The town naturally was beside itself with speculation. Mrs. Henderson had apparently appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of the budding romance, providing running commentary to anyone who would listen. Colt heard the reports secondhand through Jake, who seemed to take perverse pleasure in relaying them. "Mrs. Henderson says you two are practically engaged," Jake reported one morning as they rode out to check water troughs. "Says she's already planning what hat she'll wear to the wedding." "There's no wedding." "Not yet," Jake said cheerfully. "But give it time. Even Doc Pritchard's taking bets on when you'll propose. He's got money on Christmas. Says you're the romantic type deep down. Doc Pritchard needs to mind his own business. Town's got nothing better to do than gossip, boss. You know that. Besides, could be worse. Could be betting on whether you'll drive her away with all that brooding you do." Colt shot him a look but couldn't quite muster any real irritation. Because the truth was, he wasn't brooding as much anymore. Oh, he still had his dark moments nights when he'd lie awake thinking about Sarah, and Thomas mornings when grief sat heavy on his chest like a stone. But those moments were becoming less frequent, less all-consuming. And when they came, he found himself thinking about Lydia's words. Grief as a companion, not a prison. One Sunday after church, Reverend Matthews pulled Colt aside. The Reverend was a tall, spare man with kind eyes and a tendency toward long sermons, but he'd been nothing but supportive during Colt's darkest days. "Colt, I wanted to say something." The Reverend began, his voice low enough that others milling around outside the church couldn't hear. "I've watched you these past few weeks, and I see a change, a good change. Your healing son. And I want you to know that there's no shame in that, no betrayal in choosing to live again." Colt felt his throat tighten. "Sometimes it feels like there is." "I know, but love doesn't work that way. The love you had for Sarah doesn't diminish because you're finding room in your heart for someone else. If anything, it honors her memory, shows that the love she gave you was strong enough to teach you how to love again." The Reverend smiled. "She was a special woman, your Sarah, and she'd be happy to see you smile again." Later, as Colt walked Lydia back to her shop, a ritual they'd fallen into after Sunday services, he found himself telling her about the conversation. "He's right, you know," Lydia said softly. They were walking slowly, neither in any hurry to reach their destination. The heart's capacity for love isn't finite. It doesn't run out. Feels like it sometimes. "I know. After my father died, I thought I'd never care about anyone that deeply again. It hurt too much to lose him. Why would I risk that kind of pain?" She looked up at him, her green eyes serious. "But then I realized that shutting myself off from love wasn't protecting me. It was just another kind of death. A slower, lonelier one." They'd reached her shop. Colt stood on the boardwalk, his hat in his hand, searching for words that seemed just out of reach. Finally, he said, "I'm glad you came to Rimrock." "So am I." Lydia's smile was soft, intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with impropriety and everything to do with genuine connection. "Will I see you this week?" "Probably. If I can find an excuse to come to town." You don't need an excuse, Colt. You never did. He nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and forced himself to walk away before he did something foolish, like kiss her right there on Main Street in front of God and everybody. Jake was waiting when Colt got back to the ranch, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Boss, we need to talk. Colt's good mood evaporated. He knew that tone. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, but Simpson sent word from the South Range. Says the grass is prime right now, but there's drought coming. We can see it in the creek levels. Jake leaned against the corral fence. If we're going to move that herd to market in Cheyenne, we need to do it now. Another few weeks, and we'll be pushing through dry country with not enough water. Colt's jaw tightened. The fall cattle drive to Cheyenne was necessary. They had contracts to fulfill, money to make, a reputation to maintain. But it would mean weeks on the trail, living rough, dealing with all the unpredictable dangers that came with moving several hundred head of cattle across open country. It would mean leaving Lydia. How soon? He asked. Week. Maybe 10 days to get everything organized. Colt nodded slowly, his mind already shifting into planning mode, even as something in his chest pulled tight. All right, start getting the men ready. We'll take the usual crew, you, me, Simpson, Rodriguez, and half a dozen others. Leave enough hands here to keep things running. You sure you want to go yourself? You could send me and Simpson. You know we'd get it done. I'm going. Colt's voice was firm. He'd led every major drive since starting the ranch. He wasn't going to change that now just because leaving felt harder than it used to. But that didn't mean he was happy about it. Telling Lydia was harder than Colt had anticipated. He rode into town 2 days later and found her in her shop working on an elaborate hat decorated with pheasant feathers and burgundy ribbon. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and her face lit up in a way that made his chest ache. Colt, I didn't expect you today. Is everything all right? Yeah, everything's fine. He took off his hat, turning it in his hands. But I need to tell you something. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by concern. What is it? I'm leaving on a cattle drive in a week, to Cheyenne. It'll take about 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on weather and how the cattle behave. The words came out more abrupt than he'd intended. Lydia set down the hat she'd been working on. I see. Well, that's part of ranching, isn't it? You have to move your cattle to market. Yeah, it is. Colt shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the disappointed he could see in her eyes, despite her understanding words. I just wanted you to know. Didn't want you to think I was avoiding you, or... Colt! Lydia came around the work table and placed her hand on his arm. I understand. This is your business, your livelihood. I'm not going to ask you to neglect it. I know you wouldn't. You're not like that. He covered her hand with his, a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. But I don't like the idea of being gone that long. I don't like it either, she admitted. I've gotten rather used to seeing you several times a week. The days you don't come to town feel longer somehow. They stood there for a moment, hands touching neither, quite ready to voice what they were both feeling. Then Lydia said, The harvest dance is in 4 weeks. It's the town's biggest social event of the year. I've already been informed by approximately 17 different people that I'm expected to attend. You should go. It's a good time. Whole town turns out. Will you be back by then? Colt did the math in his head. Should be, if everything goes smooth. Then I'll save you a dance, Lydia said, and the simple statement felt weighted with meaning far beyond its surface. I don't dance. Everyone dances at the harvest dance. Mrs. Henderson told me it's practically mandatory. Her eyes sparkled with gentle humor. Besides, I think you might surprise yourself. You might even enjoy it. Colt doubted that. He hadn't danced since his wedding, and the thought of doing so now felt both disloyal and impossibly tempting. But looking at Lydia's hopeful face, he found himself nodding. Maybe, if I'm back in time. You'll be back, Lydia said with confidence he wished he felt. Safe travels, Colt. And come back to me in one piece. The words "come back to me" echoed in his head as he rode back to the ranch. She'd said it casually, but there was nothing casual about the way it made him feel, like he had something to come back for, someone who would be waiting. The week before the drive passed in a blur of preparation, supplies to purchase horses to select men to organize routes to plan. Colt threw himself into the work, trying not to count the hours until he'd leave, trying not to think about how much he'd miss Lydia's visits. She came to the ranch the day before he left, bringing a package wrapped in brown paper. A going-away present, she explained, handing it to him. Open it. Inside were 3 new bandanas, not the rough cotton most cowboys wore, but finer fabric and deep blue soft enough to use as a neckerchief, but durable enough for hard use. And in one corner of each, embroidered in thread so small he almost missed it, were his initials, CD. Lydia? His voice came out rough. I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have something from me while you're gone. A reminder that someone's thinking about you. She was blushing, suddenly uncertain. If it's too forward, It's perfect, Colt interrupted. He reached out and took her hand, a gesture that was becoming more natural every time he did it. Thank you. They stood in the yard, hands clasped, and Colt felt Jake's knowing gaze from the barn, but couldn't bring himself to care. Let the man watch. Let the whole damn ranch watch. I'll see you in a few weeks, Lydia said. At the dance. At the dance, Colt agreed, and prayed he could keep that promise. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Colt led his men out. The cattle moved in a dusty, lowing river ahead of them, and the familiar rhythm of the trail settled over the group. This was work Colt knew, work he'd done dozens of times. He should have been comfortable, focused, present. Instead, all he could think about was Lydia. The first week on the trail was uneventful, the kind of steady progress every trail boss hoped for. The cattle cooperated, the weather held, and the men fell into their usual patterns of work and rest. But at night, sitting by the fire after the cattle had settled and most of the men had rolled into their bedrolls, Colt found his mind wandering back to Rimrock. He wondered what Lydia was doing, whether she was working late in her shop, her fingers nimble on ribbons and fabric, whether she'd had many customers, whether the town women were treating her well, whether she thought about him the way he thought about her constantly, the memories playing through his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. Jake noticed, of course. The man was observant as a hawk. You're awful quiet, boss, Jake said one evening as they sat watched together, the cattle dark shapes against the starlit prairie. Even for you. Just thinking. About a certain green-eyed milliner, I'd wager. Colt didn't bother denying it. Yeah. That's good, you know. Means she matters. I know. Colt was quiet for a moment, then said, Jake, what if I'm making a mistake? What if I let myself care about her and then something happens? What if I lose her like I lost Sarah? Jake shifted in his saddle, considering his words carefully. Could happen. Life don't come with guarantees, but boss, you already lost Sarah. That pain already happened, and you survived it barely. Maybe, but you survived. Now you got a choice. You can spend the rest of your life hiding from anything that might hurt, or you can be brave enough to risk it again. Doesn't feel brave, feels terrifying. That's because it is terrifying. Real love always is. But it's also the best damn thing in the world. Jake's voice softened. Sarah gave you that gift, boss. She taught you how to love. Don't waste that lesson by being too scared to use it. They rode in silence after that, but Jake's words stayed with Colt, settling into his bones alongside the ache of missing Lydia. The second week brought trouble. It started with clouds building on the western horizon, not the white fluffy kind that promised a gentle rain, but dark roiling masses that spoke of serious weather. By midday, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. The cattle grew restless, sensing the storm's approach. We need to find shelter, Simpson said, riding up beside Colt. The younger man was one of Colt's best hands with good instincts and a level head. There's a canyon about 5 miles north. We could hold the herd there, wait it out. Colt nodded, already making the same calculation. Let's move them. Carefully. Don't want them spooked. They almost made it. The storm hit when they were still 2 miles from the canyon, coming on with the sudden fury that made prairie storms so dangerous. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to mud within minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, bright as day and twice as loud. And the cattle, already nervous, panicked. What followed was every trail boss's nightmare, a stampede in the rain and mud, hundreds of animals running blind with terror, while men on horseback tried desperately to turn them, control them, keep them from scattering across miles of open prairie, or killing themselves in their panic. Colt rode like the devil was chasing him, shouting orders that were lost in the thunder, trying to get to the front of the herd to turn the leaders. Jake was somewhere to his left, Rodriguez to his right, all of them focused on one goal: stop the cattle before someone got killed. It took 3 hours, 3 exhausting, terrifying hours before they finally got the herd turned and milled into a tight circle the cattle's energy spent. By then the rain had eased to a steady drizzle, and every man was soaked to the bone, covered in mud and shaking with exhaustion. "Head count," Colt ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting, "and check for injuries." Miraculously, they'd lost only a dozen head, far fewer than they might have. But 2 of the men had minor injuries, and when they finally got to the canyon and took stock of their situation, the real problem became clear. The storm had caused flash floods. The normally dry creek bed they'd planned to follow for the next 3 days was now a raging river impassable. And worse, the bridge at Devil's Crossing, the only safe way across for another 40 miles, had been washed out. "We'll have to detour," Jake said, his face grim as they studied their worn trail map. "At least 4 days, maybe 5. And that's assuming we don't hit more weather." Colt did the math and felt his heart sink. 4 or 5 extra days meant they'd be cutting it dangerously close to make it back for the harvest dance. Hell, they might not make it back at all. He thought about Lydia waiting for him, saving him a dance her face when he didn't show up. The disappointment, the worry that maybe he'd decided he didn't want to come back at all. "Boss," Jake was watching him. "What do you want to do?" Colt looked at his men, tired, wet, and still recovering from the stampede. He looked at the cattle, finally calmed but needing rest. He looked at the flooded landscape and knew there was only one choice. "We detour, carefully, and we make up time where we can without risking the herd or the men." "Yes, sir." The next 5 days were a grinding test of endurance. They pushed hard but not recklessly, moving the cattle through rough country while keeping watch for more weather. At night, Colt would take out one of Lydia's bandanas he'd worn, a different one each week like a talisman, and trace the embroidered initials, thinking about her hands working the thread, thinking about her waiting for him. By the time they reached Cheyenne and sold the herd, Colt was calculating frantically. 3 days to settle accounts and get supplies for the ride home. 2 days of hard riding to make it back to Rimrock. That would put them back the morning of the harvest dance, maybe. "We're going to kill the horses," Jake warned, "and ourselves. Then we'll rest for a day in Cheyenne and leave at first light," Colt amended. "But after that, we ride hard." Jake grinned. "Awful motivated to get back for a dance, boss. Shut up and check those supply lists." The ride back to Rimrock was one of the longest of Colt's life. Every mile felt like 10. Every delay, a loose shoe, a creek crossing, a brief rest for the horses chafed at him. He'd never been this impatient, this desperate to get somewhere, and he knew exactly why. He'd made Lydia a promise. More than that, he'd made himself a promise. To try. To be brave enough to risk his heart again. And he wasn't going to break that promise if there was any way to keep it. They made it to the outskirts of Rimrock, just as dusk was falling on the evening of the harvest dance. The men were exhausted, the horses were blown, and Colt looked like he'd been dragged through every mile of trail between Cheyenne and Colorado. "Go on, boss," Jake said, reining in his horse. "We'll take care of the horses and gear. You clean up and get to that dance." "Jake, that's an order from your foreman, boss. Get." Colt didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his horse toward the ranch, already planning the fastest way to make himself presentable. He had about 2 hours before the dance was in full swing, 2 hours to bathe, change, and ride back into town. He could do this. He had to. Back in Rimrock, the dance was already underway in the town's largest barn, which had been decorated with lanterns and autumn flowers for the occasion. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while musicians tuned their instruments on a small stage at the far end. The space was packed with people, ranchers and their families, townspeople dressed in their finest, even some folks from neighboring communities who'd made the trip for Rimrock's famous harvest dance. Lydia stood near one of the tables wearing a dress of deep emerald green that made her eyes glow. She'd pinned her hair up in an elaborate style, leaving soft curls framing her face. She looked beautiful, and she knew she should be enjoying herself, the music, the laughter, the festive atmosphere. But her eyes kept drifting to the door, hoping even though she'd told herself not to hope. "He'll come?" Mrs. Henderson said, appearing at Lydia's elbow with a cup of punch. "You'll see. Colt Draven's many things, but he's not a man to break his word." "He's been delayed," Lydia said, trying to sound philosophical. "It happens on cattle drives. I understand that." Course you do, dear, but you're still disappointed. That's allowed too. Lydia managed a smile. I'm fine, truly. There will be other dances. But would there? What if something had happened on the trail? What if Colt had decided during those long weeks away that whatever was growing between them wasn't worth pursuing? What if he'd realized that his grief was too deep, his heart too damaged, and he'd rather stay alone than risk it? She told herself she was being foolish, but the disappointment sat heavy in her chest anyway. Doc Pritchard asked her to dance, then Tom Murphy, then several of the younger ranch hands. Lydia accepted, graciously moving through the steps with practiced ease while her mind was elsewhere. The evening wore on, and her hope dimmed with each passing hour. He wasn't coming. Colt made it to town in record time, his horse lathered and blowing hard when he finally tied up outside the dance hall. He could hear music and laughter spilling out into the night, see the warm glow of lantern light through the windows. He looked down at himself, clean shirt and pants, his best coat boots brushed until they shone. He'd shaved so hastily, he'd nicked himself twice. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from exhaustion or nerves, he couldn't say. For a moment standing outside that barn, Colt almost turned around. What was he doing? He hadn't danced in 5 years, hadn't been to a social event as anything but a silent spectator in all that time. Walking in there felt like announcing to the whole town that Colt Draven was ready to live again, ready to care about someone again, ready to risk everything again. Then he thought about Lydia waiting inside, probably believing he'd let her down, and he knew he couldn't do that to her. She'd given him something precious, the chance to remember what it felt like to be fully human. The least he could do was show up. Colt pushed open the door and stepped inside. The barn was warm and crowded, full of movement and noise. For a moment, nobody noticed him, one more person in a sea of dancers and talkers. Then someone near the door spotted him, and a ripple of recognition spread through the crowd. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Dancers slowed. Even the musicians seemed to lose their rhythm for a beat or two. Because standing in the doorway, still dusty from the trail despite his best efforts, was Colt Draven. And everyone in Rimrock knew that Colt Draven didn't attend dances, hadn't attended anything social in 5 years. Until now. Lydia was on the far side of the barn talking with Sarah Mitchell from the dress shop when she felt the change in the room's energy. She turned, following everyone else's gaze toward the door, and her heart stopped. Colt stood there, his eyes scanning the crowd, and then they found her. Everything else seemed to fall away, the people, the music, the noise. There was just him looking at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered. He began moving through the crowd, people parting for him like water around a stone. Lydia's feet carried her forward without conscious thought meeting him halfway. They stopped a few feet apart, neither quite able to speak. "You came," Lydia finally managed her voice barely above a whisper. "I rode 60 miles today," Colt said, "because I didn't want to disappoint you." Something in Lydia's chest broke open, warm and aching and wonderful. 60 miles? Would have ridden twice that if I had to. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the trail dust. He hadn't quite managed to wash off the nick on his jaw from hasty shaving, the exhaustion in his eyes that couldn't quite hide the joy underneath. "I made you a promise, Lydia, and I keep my promises." The musicians, recovering from their shock, struck up a new tune, a slow waltz that seemed perfectly suited to the moment. Around them, couples began moving back onto the floor, but Lydia and Colt stood still, simply looking at each other. "I believe you promised me a dance," Colt said, and extended his hand. Lydia placed her hand in his. "I did." He led her onto the floor, and as the music swelled around them, Colt drew her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers with surprising gentleness. They began to move, and Lydia discovered that Colt Draven could dance. Not with flashy skill, but with a quiet competence that spoke of practice long ago muscle memory that hadn't quite forgotten. "I haven't done this in a long time," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "You're doing fine." They moved together, and gradually Colt felt something loosen in his chest. The last stubborn knot of resistance, the final wall of grief that had kept him locked away from life. It didn't disappear. He knew it would always be part of him, a scar on his soul, but it no longer owned him. "I missed you," he he said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. Every day on that trail I missed you. Lydia looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I missed you too. I kept telling myself it was foolish, we've only known each other a few months, but the ranch felt empty without you, and the days felt too long. Not foolish, Colt said. His hand tightened at her waist, drawing her infinitesimally closer. I know what I feel, Lydia, and it scares me half to death, but I'm done running from it. What do you feel? The question hung between them, weighted with hope and fear and possibility. Around them, other couples danced and talked and laughed, but in their small circle, there was only truth. I feel alive again, Colt said. For the first time since Sarah died, I feel like I have something to live for beyond just getting through the day. And that's because of you. Because you saw past the grief to whoever I am underneath it all. Because you didn't try to fix me or save me, you just let me be broken and still thought I was worth knowing. A tear escaped down Lydia's cheek. You were always worth knowing. You just needed to remember that yourself. The music shifted into another waltz and then another, but neither of them made any move to leave the floor. They danced as if they had all the time in the world, holding on to each other like lifelines. Two people who'd found something unexpected and precious in the midst of frontier hardship and personal grief. Jake, watching from the sidelines with a cup of punch in his hand, felt his throat get tight. He'd worked for Colt Draven for 8 years, had seen him at his lowest point, had watched him build walls that seemed impenetrable. And now here was his boss dancing with a woman from Boston and looking happier than Jake had seen him since before tragedy struck. It's a miracle, Mrs. Henderson whispered to Doc Pritchard. I never thought we'd see Colt Draven dance again. Love's the best medicine there is, Doc replied, his old eyes twinkling. Better than anything I've got in my bag. Finally, as the evening grew late and the crowd began to thin, Colt led Lydia outside. The night air was cool and fresh after the warmth of the barn, and stars blazed overhead in the clear autumn sky. They walked in silence to where a bench sat under a cottonwood tree, providing a view of both the dance hall and the town beyond. They sat shoulders touching, neither quite ready to let go of the evening's magic. Thank you for coming back, Lydia said softly. I know it wasn't easy. It was the easiest thing in the world, because you were here. Colt turned to face her, and in the moonlight his storm-gray eyes held a vulnerability that took her breath away. Lydia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me. I'm listening? I loved my wife. She was everything to me, and when she died, when I lost her and my son, I thought I'd never survive it. For a long time, I didn't want to survive it. His voice was steady, but she could hear the emotion underneath. I spent 5 years existing, but not living. And I thought that was how it would always be, how it should be. Like I didn't deserve to be happy after failing to protect them. Lydia started to protest, but Colt shook his head gently. Let me finish. Because what I realized somewhere between here and Cheyenne is that Sarah wouldn't want that for me. She'd want me to live, to find joy again, he took a breath, to love again if I was lucky enough to find someone worth loving. He took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle on her skin. I can't promise I won't have dark days. Can't promise the grief won't come back sometimes, that I won't miss her until it aches. But I can promise that I'm ready to try. Ready to be brave enough to risk my heart again. Because Lydia, you make me want to. You make me remember what it feels like to be fully alive. Lydia was crying now, tears streaming down her face in the moonlight. Colt, I know it's fast. I know we should probably take things slower, be sensible. But I'm 40 years old and I've learned that life is too short and too precious to waste time pretending we don't feel what we feel. He brought her hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I'm falling in love with you, Lydia Fairborn. And I'm terrified, but I'm also more sure of this than I've been of anything in years. For a moment, Lydia couldn't speak. Her heart was so full she thought it might burst. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, gentle, tentative, but full of promise. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered, and I'm terrified, but I'm also ready to be brave with you. Colt pulled her close and they sat there under the stars holding each other as the sounds of the dance floated out into the night. Inside the barn, the musicians played one last waltz, But outside in the quiet darkness, two people who'd both known grief and loss were learning how to hope again, learning how to live again, learning how to love again. They sat together under the cottonwood tree for what might have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. The music from the barn had faded to occasional notes drifting on the night breeze, and most of the lanterns had been extinguished. The dance was ending, but neither Colt nor Lydia made any move to leave their spot. Finally, Colt said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to be honest with you about something I'm ashamed of." Lydia shifted slightly to look at him, her hand still in his. "You can tell me anything. I'm terrified." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back too long. Not just nervous or worried, genuinely terrified. Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. I know what it feels like to bury the people you love, to wake up every morning wishing you hadn't to carry on because you have to, but not because you want to. His grip on her hand tightened, almost painful. And the thought of going through that again, of loving you and then losing you, it makes me want to run, to push you away before I get in any deeper, to go back to that numb, hollow existence, because at least then nothing could hurt me. "But you didn't run," Lydia said softly. "No, because as terrified as I am of losing you, I'm more terrified of never having had you at all. Of looking back when I'm old and realizing I was too much of a coward to take the chance." He turned to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "But Lydia, I need you to understand what you're getting into. I'm not the man I was before Sarah died. That man was younger, more optimistic, believed the world was basically good. This man," he gestured to himself, "this man knows how cruel life can be, knows that happiness is fragile and can be snatched away in an instant." "I know that too," Lydia replied. "Maybe not as deeply as you do, but I understand. When my father died, something in me died with him. The naive girl who thought love meant safety, who thought if you were good and careful and did everything right, nothing bad would happen. That girl doesn't exist anymore." She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his rough cheek. "But Colt, here's what I learned, that you maybe haven't learned yet. Yes, pain comes. Loss comes. Grief comes, and it's terrible, and it changes us forever. But joy comes too. Love comes too. Beauty and laughter, and moments like this, sitting under the stars with someone who makes your heart feel too big for your chest. And those things, they're worth the risk. What if I'm not strong enough?" The question was barely a whisper, raw and vulnerable. "What if something happens to you and I break completely this time? What if there's no coming back?" "Then you break," Lydia said simply. "And you put yourself back together again, piece by piece, the way you've been doing for the past 5 years. Because that's what living means, Colt. It means risking the break. It means choosing to feel everything, the pain and the joy, instead of feeling nothing at all." She leaned her forehead against his. "I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. I can't promise I won't die young or get sick or leave you somehow. But I can promise that whatever time we have, I'll make it worth the risk. I'll love you with everything I have. And if you're brave enough to let yourself be happy, even knowing it might not last forever, then I'm brave enough to stand beside you and face whatever comes." Colt closed his eyes, feeling tears he hadn't shed in years threatening to fall. "You make it sound possible. It is possible. It's more than possible, it's already happening. You're already choosing it just by being here with me tonight." Her voice gentled. "And you don't have to do it alone. That's what love means, isn't it? Having someone to carry the weight with you when it gets too heavy." For a long moment they sat in silence, breathing together, their hearts finding a shared rhythm. Then Colt took a deep, shuddering breath and said, "All right, all right, all right. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing to be terrified and hopeful and alive all at once." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and there was something different in his gaze, still grief, still fear, but also determination and a fragile, growing joy. "I'm choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserve a second chance at happiness." Lydia's smile was radiant even in the darkness. "You do deserve it, and I'm going to remind you of that every day until you believe it yourself. That might take a while. Good thing I'm patient." Colt laughed. Actually laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. And in that moment, sitting under the stars with Lydia's hand in his, He felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. Real tangible hope for a future that might actually be worth living. They finally stood reluctant to end the evening, but knowing they should. Colt walked Lydia back to her shop, their hands swinging gently between them, neither speaking but both aware that something fundamental had shifted. At her door he hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead, a promise of more to come, but taking things at a pace they could both handle. "Good night, Lydia." "Good night, Colt. And thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to try." The words stayed with him all the way back to the ranch, warming him against the night chill better than any coat. The next morning, Jake took one look at Colt's face and grinned. "Well, well, that dance must have gone pretty well." "It did." "You going to tell me about it or make me drag it out of you?" Colt considered, then decided that Jake had earned the right to know. "I told her how I feel, and she feels the same way." "Hallelujah, and pass the biscuits," Jake said, his weathered face creasing with genuine happiness. "Boss, that's the best news I've heard in years. So what happens now, she?" "Now, Shin." Colt looked out over his ranch, the land he'd built with Sarah, the home he'd shared with her, the memories that lived in every fence post and building. "Now I figure out how to live again. Really, live, not just exist." "That's a tall order." "Yeah, but I think I'm ready." And he was. Over the weeks that followed, Rimrock witnessed a transformation that some called miraculous and others called long overdue. Colt Draven. The man who'd been a ghost for 5 years began rejoining the world of the living. It started small. The Sunday after the harvest dance, Colt arrived at church, and instead of sitting in his usual back pew where he could escape quickly, he sat in the middle of the congregation. When Reverend Matthews announced a church social to raise funds for a new bell, Colt didn't just donate money, he volunteered to help organize it. Mrs. Henderson nearly fainted when he stopped her on the street to ask about the social's details. "Mr. Draven, I mean Colt. How wonderful. We could certainly use someone with your organizational skills. Perhaps you and Miss Fairborn could work together on the planning committee." The suggestion was about as subtle as a hammer, but Colt just smiled, something the town was slowly getting used to seeing on his face. "That sounds fine, Mrs. Henderson." "Truly." "Oh, how marvelous. I'll let Lydia know immediately. She'll be so pleased." As Mrs. Henderson hurried off to spread the news, which would undoubtedly reach every corner of Rimrock by nightfall, Colt stood on the boardwalk and realized something: he didn't mind the gossip anymore. Let them talk. Let them speculate and plan and matchmake to their heart's content. For the first time in years, he had nothing to hide from. That evening, he knocked on Lydia's door carrying a basket from Cookie Fresh Bread and a jar of preserves, the cook's way of showing approval of Colt's courtship. Lydia opened the door in a simple house dress, her hair down around her shoulders, and Colt felt his breath catch. "Cookie sent provisions," he said, holding up the basket. "Says you're too skinny and need feeding up." Lydia laughed and invited him in. Her living quarters above the shop were small but cozy, decorated with touches that were pure Lydia books stacked on every available surface, sketches of hat designs pinned to the walls, a small stove that she clearly used for more than just making tea. "Tell Cookie I appreciate the concern, but I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself," she said, setting the basket on her tiny table. "Although this bread does smell divine." They shared the bread with butter and jam, sitting across from each other at the small table, and talked about everything and nothing. The church social, the upcoming winter, the new hat design Lydia was working on, the young Colt was training. Conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences that felt as natural as breathing. When Colt finally left later than was probably proper, but neither of them cared much about propriety, he realized that this was what he'd been missing. Not just romance or companionship, but the simple pleasure of sharing his day with someone who cared, of being known and accepted completely. The pattern repeated over the following weeks. Colt found excuses to come to town more often, though after a while he stopped bothering with excuses and just came because he wanted to see Lydia. They'd have coffee at her shop, or he'd help her carry supplies from Murphy's store, or they'd simply walk together, talking or not talking content, just to be in each other's presence. The town watched with approval and barely concealed delight. Bets were made on when Colt would propose. Mrs. Henderson kept a running commentary on every interaction she witnessed or heard about. Doc Pritchard claimed credit for the whole thing, saying he'd known from the first day that Lydia was exactly what Colt needed. But it wasn't just Lydia's presence that was changing Colt. It was the ripple effect of letting himself care again, of opening up that locked-down part of himself that had been frozen for so long. Once the ice started cracking, it kept going. He started accepting invitations to dinner at Jake's house, where his foreman's wife Martha fussed over him and clearly delighted in seeing him smile again. He joined the town council using his business sense to help with decisions about Rimrock's growth and development. He even went to the saloon occasionally, not to drink himself into oblivion like some men, but to play cards with other ranchers and discuss cattle prices and weather predictions. "You're becoming positively social," Jake observed one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch watching the sunset. "Next thing you know, you'll be hosting parties." "Let's not get carried away," Colt said, but there was humor in his voice. "I'm just saying, boss, this is good. This is real good." Jake was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sarah would be happy to see it." The mention of Sarah's name still brought a twinge of pain, but it was different now, softer, more like an old bruise than a fresh wound. "You think so? I know so. That woman loved you more than anything, and all she ever wanted was for you to be happy. Not that fake happy where you pretend everything's fine, but real genuine happiness." Jake looked at him seriously. "You've been grieving for 5 years, and that's right and proper. But there comes a time when grief needs to make room for other things: joy, love, hope. And I think that time's here, boss." Colt nodded slowly. "I'm starting to think you're right." One Sunday in late November after church services, Colt did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He visited the cemetery. He'd avoided it deliberately, unable to face the physical reminder of what he'd lost. But on this particular morning, with frost silvering the grass and the sky, a brilliant blue, he felt ready. Lydia had offered to come with him, but this was something he needed to do alone. He climbed the hill to the cottonwood tree where Sarah and Thomas lay buried. The markers he'd carved were weathered now, the wood aging to gray, but the names were still clear. He stood there for a long moment, his hat in his hands, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, but also something new, a kind of peaceful acceptance. "Hi, Sarah," he said quietly. "It's been a while. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't face coming here. Couldn't face admitting you were really gone." The wind rustled through the bare branches above, and a bird called in the distance. Colt sat down on the ground, his back against the cottonwood, and started talking. He told Sarah about the ranch, about the good years and the hard ones. He told her about Jake and Cookie and the men who'd stayed loyal even when he'd been impossible to work with. He told her about Rimrock and how the town had grown, about new buildings and new families. And then, taking a deep breath, he told her about Lydia. "Her name's Lydia Fairborn. She came here from Boston to take over her aunt's millinery shop. And Sarah, she's special. She's smart and brave and kind, and she makes me laugh. She makes me remember what it feels like to be alive." His voice cracked slightly. "I think I'm falling in love with her. Maybe already have fallen. And I wanted you to know. Wanted your blessing, if that makes any sense." He was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. "I'll always love you, Sarah. You and Thomas, you'll always be part of me. But I think I'm ready to live again. Ready to be happy again. And I hope that's okay with you. I hope you'd understand." The wind picked up gentle and warm despite the cold morning, and Colt felt something settle in his chest. Not closure exactly, he wasn't sure closure was possible or even desirable, but acceptance. Permission to move forward while still carrying his love for Sarah with him. He stayed for a while longer, talking about small things, feeling more at peace than he had in years. When he finally stood to leave, he placed his hand on Sarah's marker and said, "Thank you for everything you gave me, for teaching me how to love. I won't waste that lesson." Walking back down the hill, Colt felt lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. And when he arrived in town and saw Lydia waiting outside her shop, she'd known where he was going and had wanted to be there when he returned. He walked straight to her and pulled her into his arms. "How are you?" she asked softly, her hands rubbing soothing circles on his back. "I'm good, really good." He pulled back to look at her. "Want to take a walk?" They walked through town and out along the creek, their hands linked, talking about nothing important and everything important. Colt told her about visiting the cemetery, about talking to Sarah, about the peace he'd found there. Lydia listened without judgment or jealousy, understanding that his past didn't diminish what they were building together. "You know what I realized up there," Colt said as they stopped to watch the water flow past. "Grief isn't something you get over. It's something you integrate. It becomes part of who you are, changes you, but it doesn't have to define you completely." "That's very wise." "I learned it from a stubborn milliner from Boston." Lydia laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder. "The stubborn milliner is very proud of you." As November turned to December, Rimrock prepared for Christmas with its usual enthusiasm. Garlands appeared on storefronts, and the church organized a Christmas pageant. The town council debated whether to erect a community Christmas tree in the center of town, a new idea that some thought foolish and others thought wonderful. Colt, to everyone's surprise, came down firmly on the side of the tree. "Why not?" he said at the meeting, his voice carrying across the packed room. "This town's been good to me, good to all of us. Let's celebrate that. Let's show our children that even in a hard land, there's room for joy and tradition." The motion passed, and volunteers were organized to cut down a suitable tree and transport it to town. Colt volunteered his wagon and his time, and when Lydia offered to help decorate, he found himself looking forward to the whole affair with an enthusiasm that would have been incomprehensible 6 months ago. The tree decorating party became one of those community events that Rimrock would talk about for years. Half the town turned out bringing ornaments and garlands and strings of popcorn. Children ran around shrieking with excitement, while adults called out suggestions and argued good-naturedly about the best placement for each decoration. Colt and Lydia worked side by side, hanging ornaments and laughing at the chaos around them. At one point, Mrs. Henderson bustled over with a piece of mistletoe and an expression of unholy glee. "You know the tradition, Mr. Draven," she said, holding the mistletoe over their heads. Colt looked at Lydia, saw the blush rising in her cheeks and the laughter in her eyes, and thought, why not? He was done hiding, done pretending he didn't feel what he felt. So in front of half of Rimrock, he leaned down and kissed Lydia. Nothing scandalous, just a gentle press of lips that nevertheless made several women sigh, and one old cowboy whistle appreciatively. When they broke apart, Lydia was grinning. "Well, that'll give them something to talk about." "Let them talk," Colt said, and meant it. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow making the landscape sparkle like it had been dusted with diamonds. Colt attended church services with more genuine joy than he'd felt in years, and when Reverend Matthews spoke about hope and renewal and second chances, Colt felt like the words were meant specifically for him. After services, he walked Lydia home, a Sunday ritual they'd established, and lingered on her doorstep, reluctant to let the day end. "I have something for you," Lydia said, disappearing inside and returning with a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with ribbon. "Merry Christmas, Colt." Inside was a warm scarf knitted in deep blue wool, soft as a cloud. "Lydia, this is... I made it myself. Well, I tried. I'm better with ribbon than knitting needles, but I wanted you to have something personal." She was nervous, he realized, worried he wouldn't like it. "It's perfect," he said, wrapping it around his neck despite already wearing a coat. "Thank you." "You're welcome. I just thought, you're always outside in the cold, and I wanted you to have something that would keep you warm. Something from me." Colt reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you too." Lydia opened it to find a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide. It was beautiful and clearly expensive, the kind of jewelry that spoke of thought and care in its selection. "Colt, this is too much." "It's not. The first time I saw you, you were laughing, and it reminded me of birdsong. Made me feel like something frozen inside me was starting to thaw." He helped her pin it to her dress. "You gave me my life back, Lydia. A brooch seems like a pretty small thank you for that." She kissed him then, right there on her doorstep in broad daylight, and neither of them cared who might see. The new year rolled in with a week of bitter cold that kept most people close to their fires. Colt used the time to catch up on ranch paperwork and plan for the spring. But he also found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, thinking about the future with anticipation rather than dread. He imagined next Christmas with Lydia. Imagined springtime with her beside him watching the new calves. Imagined years stretching out ahead, full of the ordinary moments that made up a life morning coffee and evening conversations, shared laughter and quiet companionship, the steady accumulation of memories that would sustain them through hard times. He imagined for the first time since Sarah's death that he might be happy again. Truly, lastingly happy. One evening in mid-January, as Colt and Jake sat in the ranch house going over accounts, Jake said, "You're going to ask her to marry you, aren't you?" Colt looked up from the ledger, not bothering to pretend he didn't know what Jake meant. "Yeah, I am." "Good. When? Soon. I'm just trying to figure out how to do it right." Jake grinned. "Boss, I've known you for 8 years, and I can tell you this, nothing you do is ever halfway. When you decide something, you commit to it completely. So whatever you decide, it'll be right because it'll be genuine." "Thanks, Jake." "One more thing." Jake's expression turned serious. "You deserve this. You deserve to be happy to have a partner to build a life with someone you love. Don't let guilt or fear or anything else make you doubt that. You hear me?" Colt knotted his throat tight. "I hear you." The next Sunday, after walking Lydia home from church, Colt took her hand and said, "Come with me. There's somewhere I want to take you." He'd brought his buggy, and he drove them out to his ranch, but instead of stopping at the house, he continued up the hill to the cottonwood tree where Sarah and Thomas were buried. Lydia looked at him questioningly, but didn't ask, trusting him to explain. At the top of the hill, Colt helped her down and led her to the graves. The markers stood stark against the snow, and for a moment Lydia felt uncertain about why he'd brought her here. "I want you to meet them," Colt said quietly. "Sarah and Thomas. They were everything to me once, and they'll always be part of who I am." He looked at Lydia, his eyes clear and honest. "But I realized something. Loving them doesn't mean I can't love you. My heart's big enough for both, for the love I had and the love I'm building now." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, Colt, I needed you to know that. Needed you to understand that when I say I love you, and I do love you, Lydia, with everything I have, it's not because you're replacing Sarah. You're not a substitute or a second choice. You're your own person, and I love you for who you are. For the courage you showed in moving west, for the kindness you show everyone you meet, for the way you made me believe I could live again." He took both her hands in his. "I wanted to tell you here because this is where my past is. But my future, our future, if you'll have me, that's somewhere else. That's down there." He gestured toward the ranch spread out below them. "That's in Rimrock, in your shop, and all the places we'll go together. The past will always be part of me, but it's not all of me anymore. And that's because of you." Lydia was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. "I understand. And Colt, I never wanted to replace Sarah. I just wanted to stand beside you and help carry whatever you needed to carry. You've done more than that. You've given me a reason to want to carry it at all." He pulled her close, and they stood together on that hill, the cold wind whipping around them, and Colt felt a sense of completion he'd thought he'd never feel again. As they drove back down to the ranch house, Lydia said, "Thank you for bringing me there, for sharing that with me." "There's nowhere and nothing I wouldn't share with you," Colt replied. "That's how I know this is real. That's how I know you're the one." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with promise, and Lydia reached over to take his hand, holding on tight, as they rode toward whatever future they would build together. Over the weeks that followed, Colt continued to transform in ways both large and small. He smiled more readily, laughed more often. He engaged with the community not out of obligation, but genuine interest. He hosted a Sunday dinner at his ranch, his first social event in 5 years, and managed to enjoy himself despite his initial nervousness. But the most important change was invisible to everyone but those who knew him best. The wall of ice around his heart had finally melted completely, and in its place was something warm and alive and full of hope. He no longer woke up dreading the day ahead. He no longer saw his life as something to be endured. Instead, he saw possibility. He saw a future with Lydia bright and real and worth fighting for. He saw happiness not as something he'd lost forever, but as something he could build again, different from before, but no less precious. And as winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, as snow melted and the land began to wake from its frozen sleep, Colt Draven felt himself waking too. Not just surviving, but truly living his heart open and his spirit free, ready at last to embrace whatever joy the future might hold. By late February, Colt had made his decision. He knew what he wanted, knew it with a certainty that went bone deep. But he also knew that doing it right mattered. This wasn't just about him and Lydia, it was about honoring the journey they'd both taken to get here, about respecting what they were building together. He started planning in secret, which proved more difficult than expected in a town the size of Rimrock, where everyone knew everyone else's business. But Jake proved invaluable, running interference when needed, and helping Colt make arrangements without the whole town finding out immediately. "You're really doing this," Jake said one evening as they sat in the ranch office, Colt turning a small velvet box over in his hands. "I'm really doing this." "Nervous? Terrified? What if she says no?" Jake laughed outright at that. "Boss, that woman looks at you like you hung the moon. She's not going to say no. Trust me on this." "She could. She's got a successful business, a whole life here. Maybe she doesn't want to complicate it by marrying a rancher with more baggage than a freight wagon. Or maybe she's been waiting for you to ask since about October." Jake's expression softened. "You're overthinking this, boss. The hard part was letting yourself fall in love, asking her to marry you. That's the easy part." Colt wished he felt as confident, but he trusted Jake's judgment. And he trusted what he felt in his heart, a certainty that Lydia Fairborn was his future if she'd have him. He chose a Sunday in early March when the first hints of spring were appearing on the hillsides. Green shoots pushing through the last of the snow crocuses blooming in sheltered spots, the air carrying a warmth that promised better weather ahead. It seemed fitting somehow this time of renewal and new beginnings. After church, Colt asked Lydia if she'd take a walk with him. She agreed immediately, as he'd known she would, and they set off toward the small park at the edge of town where a grove of aspen trees stood white and graceful against the blue sky. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands linked, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with words. Colt's heart was hammering so hard, he was surprised Lydia couldn't hear it, but he kept his expression calm, waiting for the right moment. When they reached a clearing in the aspens where a bench overlooked the valley, Colt stopped. The view was spectacular, rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains, the town nestled below like something from a painting, and everywhere that sense of space and possibility that defined the West. "This is beautiful," Lydia said, taking in the scene. "I've walked past here dozens of times but never stopped to really look." "I used to come here sometimes," Colt said. "In the bad years when the ranch felt too empty and the town felt too full of people who didn't know what to say to me, I'd come here and just sit trying to figure out how to keep going." Lydia squeezed his hand, understanding, without words. "I came here about a week ago." Colt continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "And I realized something. This spot, it's right between my past and my future. Sarah's buried on that hill there." He pointed toward his ranch in the distance. "And your shop is down there in town. And I'm standing here in the middle, finally ready to move forward." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Lydia, 6 months ago, I was barely alive. Going through motions, existing but not living, convinced I'd never feel anything real again. And then you came to Rimrock with your green eyes and your stubborn independence and your refusal to treat me like I was broken beyond repair." "Colt," Lydia started, but he shook his head gently. "Let me finish, because I've been practicing this speech for 2 weeks, and if I stop now, I'll lose my nerve." He smiled, and she smiled back, her eyes already glistening with tears. "You made me remember what it felt like to be human. You showed me that grief doesn't have to be a prison, that loving someone doesn't mean betraying the memory of someone else. You taught me how to live again." He released one of her hands and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small velvet box. Lydia's free hand flew to her mouth, and she made a small sound, half laugh, half sob. "Lydia Fairborn," Colt said. And then he did something he hadn't done since he was a young man proposing to Sarah. He knelt down on one knee in the melting snow, holding up the box like an offering. "You brought me back to life when I thought I was beyond saving. You made me believe in second chances and hope, in futures worth building. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you've made me?" He opened the box, revealing a ring not ostentatious but beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the afternoon light. "It's the color of your eyes, Vic," he added quietly. "Or as close as I could find." For a moment, Lydia couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was shaking her head not in refusal, but in wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe this was happening. Then she dropped to her knees in front of him, not caring about the wet ground, and cupped his face in her hands. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. I love you, Colt Draven. I love your strength and your vulnerability and the way you've fought so hard to live again. I love everything. You are the man you were, the man you are now, and the man you're becoming. So yes, I'll marry you. I'd be honored to marry you." Colt's hands were shaking as he took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He'd bribed Mrs. Henderson into finding out Lydia's ring size, swearing her to secrecy, with the promise of being the first to know when he proposed. Then he pulled Lydia into his arms, holding her so tightly it was almost painful, and felt something break open in his chest, all the fear and grief and loneliness of the past 5 years finally giving way to joy. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the snow and the grass holding each other while the sun moved across the sky and the world continued around them oblivious to the miracle taking place in this small clearing. Finally, Colt pulled back far enough to look at her. "We should probably stand up before we freeze to the ground." Lydia laughed that bright, genuine laugh that had first caught his attention months ago and let him help her to her feet. They were both soaked from the knees down, but neither cared. Colt kissed her, then properly and thoroughly pouring into it all the love and gratitude and hope he couldn't quite put into words. When they broke apart, Lydia looked at the ring on her finger, turning her hand so the sapphire caught the light. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This whole thing is perfect. I wanted to do it right. You deserve that." "What I deserve," Lydia said firmly, "is you, exactly as you are. And now I get to keep you forever." She grinned suddenly. "Mrs. Henderson is going to lose her mind. She's been dropping hints about weddings since October. Actually, she helped me find out your ring size." She knew Colt Draven. "Are you telling me that Mrs. Henderson knew you were going to propose and didn't immediately tell the entire town? I made her promise, said if she kept the secret, she could be the first to know after you said yes." As if summoned by her name, they heard a distant but distinctive voice calling from the direction of town. "Mr. Draven? Miss Fairborn, are you up there?" Colt and Lydia looked at each other and burst out laughing. "Should we tell her?" Lydia asked. "Might as well. The whole town's going to know within the hour anyway." They made their way back toward town, and sure enough, Mrs. Henderson was hurrying up the path with the determination of a woman on a mission. She took one look at their joined hands, the ring glinting on Lydia's finger and their matching smiles, and let out a squeal that probably carried to the next county. Oh, you did it," she said. "Yes. Oh, this is wonderful. The most wonderful news." She pulled them both into a surprisingly strong hug. "I knew it would happen. I just knew it. From the very first day when I saw you looking at each other. Oh, Reverend Matthews owes me $5. I bet him you'd propose before April." She stopped suddenly, mortified. "Not that I was betting on your personal life, of course. That would be inappropriate." "Of course," Colt said solemnly, though his eyes were dancing with amusement. "When's the wedding?" "Oh, say it soon. Spring weddings are lovely, or perhaps a summer wedding. You'll need time to plan, of course, but not too much time at your age. There's no point in long engagements." "Mrs. Henderson," Lydia interrupted gently, "we just got engaged 5 minutes ago. We haven't planned anything yet." "Well, when you do, I expect to be involved in the preparations. I consider myself partly responsible for this match after all." As they walked back into town with Mrs. Henderson chattering excitedly, Colt squeezed Lydia's hand and felt a wave of contentment wash over him. This was real. This was happening. He was going to marry Lydia Fairborn, and for the first time in 5 years, the future looked bright instead of bleak. By the time they reached Main Street, half the town had somehow gotten word. People emerged from shops and homes, calling out congratulations, shaking Colt's hand, hugging Lydia, exclaiming over the ring. Doc Pritchard declared it the best news Rimrock had seen in years. Tom Murphy insisted on breaking out a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. Even the usually taciturn men from the saloon came out to offer their good wishes. Jake arrived on horseback, having ridden in from the ranch when one of the hands brought word. He dismounted and pulled Colt into a backslapping hug that would have knocked over a smaller man. Congratulations, boss. You did good. Real good. Couldn't have done it without you, Jake. Nah, you did the hard part. I just watched. Jake turned to Lydia and took her hand gently. Ma'am Lydia, I just want to say you're getting a good man. Best man I know. And he's getting one hell of a woman. You two are going to be real happy together. Thank you, Jake, Lydia said, her eyes suspiciously bright. That means a lot. The impromptu celebration lasted well into the evening. Someone produced a fiddle and someone else brought out more bottles, and before long there was dancing in the street and laughter echoing off the buildings. Colt found himself in the middle of it all, accepting congratulations and toasts, his arm around Lydia's waist, and thought, this is what it means to be part of a community. This is what I'd been missing. Later, after the celebration had wound down and most people had headed home, Colt walked Lydia back to her shop. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the night air carried just a hint of warmth. Spring was definitely coming. At her door, Lydia turned to face him. So, we're getting married. We are. Having second thoughts? Not even for a moment, you. Not a one. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips, soft, sweet kisses full of promise. When do you want to do this? Lydia considered. Mrs. Henderson's right about one thing. There's no point in a long engagement. We're both adults, we know what we want. What would you say to New Year's Day that gives us time to plan properly, but not so much time that we're just waiting around? New Year's Day, Colt repeated, testing the words. A new year, a new beginning, a new life together. That's perfect. And Colt, I want your friends and mine, the people we care about. But I don't need a big fancy wedding, just something real and true with the people who matter. That sounds exactly right. He pulled her close one more time. I love you, Lydia. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for asking. Thank you for being brave enough to try again. She smiled against his chest. Now go home and get some sleep. We have a wedding to plan. The months leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Lydia continued running her shop while also making plans she wanted to keep the business even after marriage, and Colt supported that completely. They'd figure out the logistics of living between town and ranch, but there was no question of her giving up something she'd built. Colt worked to make the ranch house ready, fixing things he'd let slide for years, repainting rooms, making it feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. He kept Sarah's memory. There were still a few photographs, a painting she'd loved, but he also made space for new memories for the life he and Lydia would build together. Jake watched these preparations with satisfaction. House is starting to feel alive again, he commented one day. Been too quiet for too long. Yeah, Colt agreed, looking around at the freshly painted walls and new curtains, Lydia's touch already evident. It has been. As fall turned to winter and December arrived, the whole town seemed to catch wedding fever. It helped that it was the first major social event since the Harvest Dance and the first wedding in Rimrock in over a year. Everyone wanted to contribute something. Cookie insisted on making the wedding cake, Mrs. Henderson organized the decorations, even the saloon owner donated whiskey for the reception. Christmas came and went in a happy haze, and then suddenly it was New Year's Eve, the day before Colt and Lydia would become husband and wife. Colt spent the evening at the ranch with his men, a tradition of sorts. They sat around the fire in the bunkhouse, drinking whiskey and talking about the year past and the year to come. It was companionable and relaxed, and Colt felt grateful for these men who'd stuck by him through his darkest times. Nervous boss? One of the younger hands asked. Surprisingly, no, Colt admitted. I'm excited. Ready. It feels right. That's how you know you're marrying the right woman, Cookie said, his grizzled face thoughtful. When it feels like coming home instead of jumping off a cliff. To coming home, Jake said, raising his glass, and to second chances. To second chances, the men echoed, and Colt drank to that, his heart full. The wedding day dawned cold but brilliantly clear, the kind of winter day where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at, and every sound carries for miles. Colt woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning preparing with more care than he usually bothered with. His best suit carefully brushed, his boots polished until they shone, a new string tie that Lydia had insisted he'd look handsome in. Jake came by to help him with the tie, which Colt's nervous fingers kept fumbling. You got this, boss, Jake said quietly. Today's a good day. Best day. Yeah, Colt agreed, his voice rough with emotion. It really is. The ceremony was held in the church, which had been decorated with winter greenery and white ribbons. Every pew was packed. It seemed like all of Rimrock and half the surrounding territory had turned out to witness Colt Draven getting married again. Colt stood at the front with Reverend Matthews Jake beside him as best man and watched as the doors opened and Lydia appeared. She wore a dress of ivory silk, nothing ostentatious but elegant and beautiful, with lace at the cuffs and a fitted bodice that made her look like something from a dream. Her hair was pinned up with small flowers woven through it, and she carried a simple bouquet of winter roses that Mrs. Henderson had somehow managed to cultivate in her greenhouse. But it wasn't the dress or the flowers that made Colt's breath catch. It was her face, radiant with joy, eyes locked on his smile so bright it could have lit the whole church. She walked down the aisle alone. She had no family here to give her away, but she walked with confidence, her chin high, every inch the independent woman who'd captured his heart. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, Colt felt everything else fall away. The watching crowd, the ceremony, even the words Reverend Matthews was saying, it all faded into background. There was just Lydia, her green eyes shining, and the overwhelming certainty that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. The vows were traditional, but Colt spoke them with his whole heart. I, Colt, take you, Lydia, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. And when Lydia repeated them back to him, her voice clear and strong, Colt felt tears threatening for the first time that day. She'd chosen him. Knowing everything about his past, understanding the depth of his grief and the scars he carried, she'd chosen him anyway. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Matthews said, beaming. Colt, you may kiss your bride. Colt didn't need to be told twice. He cupped Lydia's face in his hands and kissed her tender and passionate and full of promise while the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools, and Colt thought this is what happiness feels like. I'd almost forgotten. The reception was held in the same barn where they danced at the harvest dance, and it was everything a frontier wedding celebration should be: loud, joyous, full of food and drink and music and dancing. Colt danced with his new wife, holding her close, while the fiddles played and friends and neighbors celebrated around them. Happy? Lydia asked, her head against his shoulder. Happier than I have any right to be, Colt replied. Thank you for this. For us. For giving me a reason to believe in futures again. Thank you for being brave enough to try. For opening your heart when it would have been easier to keep it closed. They danced until late into the night, and when they finally left the celebration amid cheers and well wishes and a shower of rice, Colt helped Lydia into the buggy he'd decorated with ribbons and drove them home to the ranch. The house was warm when they arrived. Fires already lit, Jake's doing, no doubt. Colt carried Lydia over the threshold, a tradition she'd insisted on with a laugh, and set her down gently in the front hall. Welcome home, Mrs. Draven, he said. It's good to be home, Mr. Draven. That night in the bedroom that Colt had remade for them, both new furniture, new curtains, nothing from his past with Sarah except the love she'd taught him, he held Lydia close and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years complete. Whole. Like a missing piece of himself had finally been restored. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, as all marriages are. Lydia split her time between the ranch and her shop, and they found a rhythm that worked for both of them. Colt learned to talk about his days, to share the small frustrations and victories that he'd been keeping to himself for years. Lydia learned the rhythms of ranch life, becoming a familiar figure among the hands, someone they respected and liked. The ranch itself seemed to change with her presence. It became warmer somehow, more welcoming. Lydia would invite people over for dinner, something Colt hadn't done in years, and the house would fill with laughter and conversation. She established a small garden, talking about Sarah's old garden with respect and affection rather than pain. She brought flowers inside music life. You've worked a miracle here, Doc Pritchard told Colt one day when he stopped by on his rounds. This ranch used to feel like a tomb. Now it feels like a home. That's all Lydia, Colt said, watching his wife through the window as she walked with Cookie toward the kitchen garden, the two of them deep in discussion about herbs. No, son, that's both of you. She brought the warmth, but you had to be willing to let it in. That's the real miracle. Summer came, and with it, the hard work of ranching branding, moving cattle, maintaining fences and water sources. Lydia helped where she could, though she was hardly built for heavy ranch work. But she kept the house running, managed the accounts she had ahead for numbers that rivaled Colt's, and generally made herself indispensable. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lydia reached over and took Colt's hand. There was something in her expression, nervous anticipation mixed with joy that made his heart skip. Colt, I have something to tell you. He turned to face her fully, suddenly aware that whatever she was about to say was important. What is it? Lydia placed his hand on her stomach flat beneath her dress and smiled. A gift. Arriving next spring. For a moment, Colt couldn't process the words. Then understanding crashed over him like a wave, and he felt every emotion at once, joy, terror, hope, fear, love so intense, it was almost painful. He couldn't quite get the words out. Pregnant. Yes. About 3 months along Doc Pritchard thinks. We're having a baby Colt. The tears he'd been holding back all day at the wedding during the ceremony through the reception finally fell. He pulled Lydia into his arms, holding her carefully now, as if she might break. A baby, he whispered into her hair. Oh, God, Lydia, are you sure? Are you all right? Is everything... I'm fine. We're fine. Doc says I'm healthy and everything looks good. She pulled back to look at him, her own eyes wet. I know this might be scary for you after... It is, Colt admitted. I'm terrified, but I'm so happy, Lydia, so incredibly happy. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you. Thank you for this gift. That night, lying in bed with his hand on Lydia's stomach, Colt talked to his unborn child. He told the baby about its mother, about how brave and strong and wonderful she was. He made promises to be there to protect them, to love them both with everything he had. And he talked to Sarah too in his heart, thanking her for teaching him how to be a father, asking her blessing on this new life. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Lydia continued working at her shop well into her 6th month, finally closing it temporarily when climbing stairs became difficult. The town rallied around them just as Rimrock always did for its own. Women brought baby clothes they'd saved or made new. Men built a cradle that could rock gently. Cookie researched recipes for foods that would help Lydia maintain her strength. Winter came again, and with it the knowledge that spring would bring their child. Colt found himself in the nursery, the room he hadn't opened since Thomas died, finally able to face it. He and Lydia repainted it together, chose new furniture, made it ready for the baby who would soon arrive. Do you want to know if it's a boy or a girl? Lydia asked one day as they worked. No, Colt said. I want to be surprised. However they come, whoever they are, I'll love them. Even if it's a girl who grows up to be as stubborn as me. Colt laughed and pulled her close, careful of her swollen belly. Especially if it's a girl as stubborn as you. In early April, on a morning when the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom on the hillsides, Lydia went into labor. Doc Pritchard was summoned, and Colt found himself pacing the parlor while muffled sounds came from upstairs. Lydia's voice, Doc's calm responses, the midwife they'd hired, offering encouragement. Jake sat with him, providing steady companionship through the long hours. She's strong, Jake kept saying. She'll be fine. They'll both be fine. What if something goes wrong? Colt's voice was raw. What if I lose her, Jake? I can't do that again. You won't. Doc Pritchard's the best there is, and Lydia's healthy and determined. Have faith, boss. The hours crawled by. Afternoon faded to evening, and still the sounds continued from upstairs. Colt wore a path in the floorboards, his mind conjuring every terrible possibility, his hands shaking with fear he couldn't quite control. Then just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, he heard it, a baby's cry, strong and healthy and achingly beautiful. Colt froze, hardly daring to breathe. Jake gripped his shoulder. That's a good sound, boss. That's a real good sound. Doc Pritchard appeared at the top of the stairs, his sleeves rolled up, and his face creased with a huge smile. Colt, you have a daughter, a beautiful, healthy baby girl, and Lydia's fine tired, but fine. You can come up now. Colt took the stairs two at a time, his heart hammering. He burst into the bedroom to find Lydia propped up against pillows, exhausted and disheveled and absolutely radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a white blanket. "Come meet your daughter," Lydia said softly. Colt approached on shaking legs and looked down at the baby in Lydia's arms. She was perfect, tiny, and red-faced with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn the same storm gray as his own. She was yawning, her little fists waving, and when Colt reached out a tentative finger, she grasped it with surprising strength. He couldn't find words big enough. "She's perfect. Lydia. She's perfect. Would you like to hold her?" With careful, reverent movements, Colt took his daughter into his arms. She was so light, so fragile, and he was struck by the fierce, protective love that surged through him, the same love he'd felt for Thomas, but different too, tempered by experience and gratitude and the knowledge of how precious this was. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise I will love you and protect you and do everything in my power to give you a good life." "What should we name her?" Lydia asked. They'd discussed names during the pregnancy, but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now looking at his daughter's face, Colt knew exactly what felt right. "Rose," he said. "Rose Margaret Draven. Rose for new beginnings, and Margaret after your mother." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "That's perfect. Rose Margaret, welcome to the world, sweetheart." Word spread quickly, as it always did in Rimrock, and soon well-wishers began arriving. Jake first, of course, standing awkwardly by the bed and looking at the baby with wonder. Then Cookie Mrs. Henderson, Doc Pritchard checking in one more time, Reverend Matthews offering a blessing. The house filled with joy and congratulations, and Colt thought, this is what family means. Not just blood, but community. People who care, who celebrate together, who support each other through everything. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful. Rose was a good baby, healthy, with a strong appetite and lungs to match when she wanted something. Colt discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed. Walking the floor at 3 a.m, while Lydia slept singing lullabies Sarah had once sung to Thomas, finding that the memories didn't hurt anymore. They were just memories, precious but no longer painful. Lydia proved to be a natural mother, loving but practical, never flustered even when Rose was fussing. She managed to reopen her shop part-time with a cradle in the back room where Rose would sleep while Lydia worked. The town women adored it, cooing over the baby while ordering their hats. "You're raising her in a millinery shop," Mrs. Henderson observed one day. "How wonderfully unconventional." "She'll learn to appreciate good craftsmanship," Lydia replied with a smile. "And independence. Can't start too early on that." As Rose grew from an infant to a toddler, Colt watched in amazement. Every milestone, the first smile, the first laugh, the first time she rolled over, then crawled, then pulled herself up to standing, felt like a miracle. He'd experienced all this before with Thomas, but then it had been shadowed by the constant terror of fever season, of the fragility of frontier life. Now, with Doc Pritchard's improved medical knowledge and simple good fortune, Rose thrived. On her first birthday, they threw a party at the ranch. The whole town invited food and games and laughter, filling the house and yard. Rose, overwhelmed by the attention, had hidden her face in Colt's shoulder, and he'd felt his heart expand to the point of breaking with love for this little person who trusted him completely. "Happy?" Lydia asked, coming to stand beside him as they watched their friends and neighbors celebrate. "I didn't know it was possible to be this happy," Colt admitted. "Some days I have to remind myself it's real, that this isn't a dream I'm going to wake up from. It's real. We made it real together." She kissed his cheek. "And Colt, I have more good news." He looked at her, seeing the familiar sparkle in her eyes, and felt his heart leap. "You're not—" "I am. About 2 months along, Rose is going to be a big sister. Their second child, a boy they named Daniel James for Jake, who'd been Colt's rock through everything, arrived the following spring. And 2 years after that, another daughter, Sarah Catherine, named for the woman whose love had taught Colt how to be a father in the first place. 3 children. 3 healthy, happy, beloved children who filled the ranch house with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. Colt sometimes stood in the doorway watching them play Rose, patient with her younger siblings. Daniel, adventurous and bold little Sarah, already showing signs of her namesake's gentle nature, and had to blink back tears. The Draven Ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its quality cattle, but for its warmth and hospitality. Travelers knew they'd find a meal and a bed there if they needed it. Neighbors knew they could count on help during hard times. Young couples just starting out found advice and support from Colt and Lydia, who'd both learned that building a life in the West took courage but was worth every hardship. Jake, now in his 60s and showing it, still ran the day-to-day operations with the same competence he always had. But he'd smile as he watched Colt with his children and tell anyone who'd listen, "I watched that man come back from the dead. Watched him learn to live again. Best thing I ever saw." On a summer evening when Rose was 7, Daniel 5, and Sarah 3, Colt found himself sitting on the porch with Lydia watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The children were in bed finally after the usual negotiations and delays. The ranch was quiet, settling into its nighttime rhythms. "Do you ever think about her?" Lydia asked softly, knowing Colt would understand who she meant. "Sometimes," Colt admitted. "Not as often as I used to, but yes, sometimes I think about Sarah and Thomas. Wonder what Thomas would have been like if he'd lived. Wonder if Sarah would approve of the man I've become. I think she would. I think she'd be proud of you." "I hope so." He reached over and took Lydia's hand. "You know what I realized the other day? I've been married to you longer now than I was married to Sarah. This life, our children, our home, everything we've built, this is my life now. Not a replacement for what I had before, but something new and equally precious." "That's how it should be," Lydia said. "The past shapes us, but it doesn't own us." Colt pulled her close and they sat together as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the house, he could hear Rose singing softly to herself one of the lullabies he'd taught her. The sound made him smile. "You know what the best part is?" he said. "What's that? I'm not afraid anymore. For years after Sarah died, I was terrified of feeling, of loving, of losing. But you taught me that love is stronger than fear, that it's worth the risk every single time." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for that, Lydia. Thank you for saving me." "You saved yourself," Lydia replied. "I just reminded you how." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell and the ranch settled into sleep. 3 children upstairs, safe and healthy, a wife beside him who'd given him back his life. A community that had supported him through his darkest times and now celebrated his joy. Land that he'd built into something lasting, something that would endure for generations. Colt Draven, once the hardest, most broken man in Colorado, finally smiled again, not the forced expressions he'd worn for years, but a genuine smile of contentment and peace and hard-won happiness. Because one woman's courage had reached the part of him he'd thought was dead forever. Because he'd been brave enough to try again, to risk his heart one more time, to choose life over mere existence. And because in the end, love had proven stronger than grief, hope stronger than despair, and the human heart's capacity for healing infinitely greater than its capacity for pain. As the moon rose over the Draven Ranch, casting silver light across the valley, Colt held his wife close and thought about the future, not with fear, but with anticipation. Tomorrow, they'd wake early for church. Rose would insist on wearing her favorite dress. Daniel would try to sneak a frog into his pocket. Sarah would want to sit on his shoulders so she could see everything. Lydia would smile at the chaos and somehow keep them all organized. It would be ordinary and messy and absolutely perfect. Because that's what living meant. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy. Not forgetting the past, but building a future anyway. Not waiting for wounds to heal completely before daring to love again, but loving through the healing, letting that love be part of the cure. Colt Draven had learned that lesson the hard way. But he'd learned it. And now surrounded by the family he'd never thought he'd have again, in the home that had finally become a home. Once more, he was grateful for every moment, the hard ones that had taught him strength, and the beautiful ones that had taught him hope. His journey from grief to joy had been long and painful, filled with setbacks and fears, and moments when giving up seemed easier than going on. But he'd persevered, he'd been brave, he'd let himself heal. And in doing so, he discovered something Sarah had known all along, that the heart's capacity for love is infinite, and that choosing to love again after loss, after pain, after everything is the bravest and most beautiful thing a human being can do. The cowboy who'd refused every woman's smile had finally found the one whose love could break through his defenses. And in letting her in, he'd found not just happiness, but himself. The end.